Good morning. Grab yourself a cup of coffee, and we'll be starting here at the bottom of the hour. And yes, I'm grabbing my coffee too. We'll be starting up here in about another minute or so. Please download the handout. The website is there on the screen, but it also is in the chat pod. If you move your mouse to the bottom of the screen, you'll see a chat pod. It's really mainly for us to send you messages during the 3 days of this workshop. We will also be doing polls during the 3 days. The easiest is actually just to go to the website. It's listed there, www.pollev.com/DavidOrPE. Um, you can download the app, but actually we're going to be doing some typing in of text. And depending on, some people prefer the keyboard, some like it on the phone. It's your call. And we'll give folks about another minute just to make sure everybody is logged in. And we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, good morning and welcome to our workshop on construction contract administration for local federal aid. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here at the New York State LTAP Center, the Cornell Local Roads program. I'll be your guide for the next 3 days. It's actually the next 3 Tuesdays, just in the mornings purposely. So I apologize for the weather. I called for rain, but it decided to be sunny instead. So I know a lot of you probably are chomping, but we'll just make it work. Um, So we are going to be using the handout. If you open up your chat pod, you should see the link to the handout. We are going to be going through that, and we'll be talking about that some here in a minute. We're also going to be doing polls using the website that you see on the screen. It will also show up on top of each of the polls as we do them if you fail to write it down or can't find it right now. And actually, we can put into the chat pod that web link as well. And I'm going to quickly do that before I forget. Okay. And that should do it. There we go. Okay. So good morning and welcome to day one. As I said, I'm the director here in Ithaca. We're going to be talking about construction contract administration. Just a couple of guideposts for us for the next 3 Tuesdays. This is all being done via Zoom. It's in webinar mode, as they call it, which means the settings are at the bottom of the screen. You can check your audio and things like that. If you're calling in, obviously you won't be able to see that, but it's really important you get yourself to a screen if at all possible, because there's a lot of stuff we're doing on screen. Open up the chat pod. Uh, it's really just for us to send you messages. We'll put in links in there during the course of the 3 days, and the handout plus any of the poll links, we'll try to put them in there for you. I may ask you to raise your hand now and then. Um, so just to illustrate that, if everybody move your mouse to the bottom and just raise your hand, we'll see if everybody's awake. Okay, cool, good to see. And we're actually going to take advantage of that technique, and then we can magically put my hands up, all the hands get lowered at once. Pretty amazing. I've got background support from Adam Howell and Nick Kuzmic today. We may have other people on the other Tuesdays, depending on how our schedules are going. We are going to be using the Q&A as well, however. I'm not going to put everything in the poll EV. So, if you've got any questions, please put them into the Q&A and we'll try to answer them. I'll try to answer them as I go, but I may just acknowledge them and we'll come back to them. And we're going to be doing lots of Q&A during the course of the 3 days. Okay, now this course is worth professional development hours here in New York State. To get those, you are going to need to come each day. 3 hours of contact time from 8:30 to noon each day. We will be taking a couple of 15-minute breaks. Yes, I'd like a little longer, but I thought it was more important to get you guys done at noon. So we're trying to do this 8:30 to noon each of the 3 days, but we will definitely be taking those breaks. If you are on Zoom and you have a problem, you get kicked out, please log back on as quickly as possible. We can monitor that. The Zoom takes care of that for us, so we can make sure we track your time. We certainly don't want to hurt you just because of technology issues. Today, we're going to be talking about introductions and starting a project. Really more than just a construction part of the process. We did a webinar a few weeks ago. It's going to be similar, but we've added in some additional information we couldn't cover in the 1 hour. We're then going to talk about contract administration and documentation on day 2. Really a lot of the federal and state provisions and some of the things you need to be aware of as you're doing these projects. And then day 3, we're going to finish up on construction monitoring and closeout. We're going to do a Q&A session with representatives from the Federal Highway Administration and New York State DOT. And by the way, we're going to be collecting your questions that you've got for them over the course of the next 2.5 weeks. So please feel free to put those in. And then finally, it's not on the agenda here, it's on the handout. We're going to be finishing with a Jeopardy game to see how you did, and see how I did as an instructor. But I need 4 volunteers who want to play Jeopardy, and everybody can play along, but I want 4 folks who are willing to play along. We'll actually bump you up so you can speak and be part of the presentation, as it were, and a little bit of Jeopardy fun to end the day 3 and as our review for the professional development hours. Now, the Q&A that we're doing with the New York State Department of Transportation and Federal Highway Administration, we have 2 folks from the Local Programs Bureau and a lady from the Office of Diversity and Opportunity to answer questions from NYSDOT. And then we have 5 individuals with Federal Highway Administration, including the Local Programs Manager, Tricia Millington, and then specialists in engineering, civil rights, pavements, materials, and major projects. And so again, if you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to put them into the Q&A, and I'll give you an opportunity in a couple of places to put those questions in, because there's no way I can answer everything, and that's part of the reason we brought these people in to help us out. Okay. Now, today's agenda, we're going to start with some introductions in the world of Zoom. We can't go around the room and have people do introductions, but we'll do a couple of polls as we get started. We're going to talk about starting and what the federal projects are like. We'll take a break at 9:30, even if we're not quite finished with starting a project. I do want to hold to the breaks. Then we're going to go to roles and responsibilities of people on a federal aid project. Take another break at 10:45, and then the last hour will be on project management and pre-construction. And then we'll do a little highlights for day 2 and day 3 to get you ready. Now, those are the schedule for the day. We'll hold the Same schedule for all 3 of the Tuesdays that we're on here, so just be aware of that. And again, we're going to be going through a handout of material that we've got. And whoop, let's go back here. There's the link to the location for the handouts. And again, that is in the chat pod. Okay. Now, if you're looking at poll everywhere, because we're going to be doing the poll EVs, it'll show up on the screen, but also it's in the chat pod as well. It's my name with the PE at the end of it. So David or PE under pollev.com. Now let's just look real briefly at the handout. Go over here and get the handout pulled up. So the handout has on it the agenda for those who are interested in it. Okay, the list of the folks for the Q&A. It has a whole bunch of links, including links to personnel from New York State DOT, the RLPLs. We'll come back to what that is in a minute. Just the one name with the New York division, but Tricia can help you find the other folks. And then a whole bunch of resources, including the Local Projects Manual, the LPM, used to be known as the PFLAF. In fact, it's still listed that way on the website. Highway Design Manual, some other resources that you may want to go through. Okay, we'll cover those a little bit as we go through the handout. A whole page of acronyms and definitions. You will purposely notice it is empty of the actual acronym and words. Part of the goal here is to help you fill those out as we go through, because we've learned if you understand those acronyms, you actually probably have a pretty good sense of what's involved. And then finally, a form and some documents from New York State DOT that you may want to use, including a project development handout and some other handouts that are available. Okay. And I don't have them on this particular version. I'm going to pull them up one at a time, including Engineer's Daily Diary and stuff like that. But I don't have them in this version because it's easier for me to follow. Okay. Just to help you understand where all this comes from, there are links to it. We're not going to open them up, but we're focused on Chapter 15 of the Local Projects Manual for this particular workshop. But a lot of this comes from the Code of Federal Regulations, sometimes known as CFR, our first acronym that we're defining, CFR. And it's Title 23 Highways. There are other titles that obviously get involved here, certain titles on equal opportunity and highways. I mean, transportation is another title that's used a lot in this case, but our focus is Title 23 Highways. And there's also a Contract Administration Core Curriculum Manual, which is a FHWA document. And a lot of the stuff that New York State has put together in the Local Projects Manual comes from that document, which is sometimes abbreviated CACC. Okay. So we'll go ahead and get started. This is going to help me. I actually know, I hope, the answer to this for the first poll that's opened up, and some of you had already answered, I noticed. But if you could put in here who you work for. Are you with a local government? Are you with the state, Federal Highway Administration, a consultant, a contractor that's not an engineering consultant, or a few folks who are thinking about the weekend, though I have forgotten what weekends are like. They blur with the last year in COVID. And again, if you need the website, it is pollev.com/David or PE. And I know some people may not be able to get the poll EV. You can put the answer in the Q&A and I'll look at it. I've got one additional local government person, for instance. Okay. Let's see how we're doing here. I'll give you just another 30 seconds or so. And we've got 3 more additional local government people. Cool. Okay. Okay, so most of you work either for a local government or a consultant, probably helping out a local government. And that's who we wanted in the room. So that's cool. And we're good with that. So that helps me. And again, we had the list of who had signed in anyway. But hopefully you'll have some fun. Oh, we got an MPO in here too. Okay. And you don't see in the poll New York City Ferry. That's still local government. It's a big local government, but it's still a local government from what we're talking about. But New York City actually has some of its own requirements and regulations, so they still follow the local projects manual in a lot of ways. But there are some specifics in New York City, and we'll try to answer a few of them if we can as we go through the course of the 3 days. Now, as we were developing these materials, we got a lot of slide decks from Federal Highway Administration, New York State DOT. We looked at the local projects manual. We also had uh, all the local projects from 2016 to 2019 sent to us, and we generated a map showing where they were around the state. Now, we took out New York City when we developed this map with the pie charts, and Nick, who's on here, thanks Nick for doing this. We took out New York City because it would have just been this big circle. They do a lot of local projects down there. Because really what we wanted to sort of see is how these projects, who's doing them, counties, cities, towns, and villages, and 654 local projects outside of New York City involving 247 local agencies. And as you can see, you can almost tell where the cities are by the size of the big pipe that are on the screen. So this is one I don't know, and you will help me out quite a bit as we go through this whole process. Again, we're going to do another poll AV, and be ready, we're going to be doing a lot of these. How many federal aid projects have you completed? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to 9, or 10 or more? And we'll give folks a chance to answer that. And again, I'll watch the Q&A if you haven't got the ability to get to the pollev.com. Okay. Okay, so it's actually about what I was going to guess. Uh, a lot of people are 10 plus. Uh, I see a couple of people in the QA are actually talking about they're still involved in their very first project, so I guess they would see 0. I didn't put 0 on here. I probably should have. And then quite a few who are have just done 1 or less. So, okay, very useful. That actually helps me quite a bit. And again, those of you who've done extra projects, help us out as we go through. If people have questions, put them in. Put the answer in the Q&A. I have no problem with that. We learn best by working with each other and collaborating. So let's keep that in mind. Now, in terms of looking at those projects, just so you know, we reviewed them all. And so we're going to break it down and just look at the local projects outside of New York City. So if you do that, you'll actually see that we have doing only one project, or counties, excuse me. For counties, of the 57 counties in New York State outside New York City, 3 did not do a local project with federal aid in that 4-year period. 6 counties only did 1 project. 6 counties only did 2 projects. But as you can see, a lot of counties did a lot of projects, as you would expect. 31 counties, over half, did 5 or more projects. So they're probably pretty good at it, as you can imagine. Cities, something more of a spread that you can see here. You know, if we added in New York City, we would have 1 more in the 5 plus column. But essentially, about 20 cities didn't do a federal aid project, but there are a lot of fairly small cities that are really a little bit larger than a village. 16 cities did only 1. 8 cities did only 2. And again, 12 cities did 5 or more, and again, are probably pretty good at doing the local projects with federal aid. Towns, it gets very different. The story almost flips from the county side of the coin. Only 108 of the 933 towns in the state did a federal aid project in that 4-year window that we were able to get the data. Of that, 92, almost 90%, just under 90% of those 108 did only 1 project, and 14 did 2 projects. In fact, there's only 1 town, and no, I'm not going to list the name of the town, did 5 or more projects. Most towns do very few projects, you know, 1 or 2 every 4 or 5 years if they do any at all. And similar story with villages. Only 43 villages out of the over 500 villages in the state did a federal aid project. 37 of them did only 1, and 5 did 2. And so there are none that did 5 or more. Okay, so what this tells us, if you look at it, essentially is 23% of the agencies only did one project. And there's the old 80-20 rule, and it's pretty clear here. About 80% of the projects are done by agencies that do a lot of projects, counties, cities, uh, but there are a lot of small agencies that do one or two projects. And as we'll go through, it's a lot of complicated materials we've got to go through. So if you're in that one or two category, there's lots of resources, there's lots of ways to get help. And I'd really like to make sure you take advantage of that if you decide to do a federal aid project. And if you decide not to, well, that's okay too. What we don't want to see is someone getting into a project and getting trapped or feeling like they can't complete it properly. And worse, not suddenly being eligible for federal aid for other projects that might be of real critical interest to your town, village, county, or city. And just as a note, by the way, 2/3 of all the local projects were done by only 63 agencies. So most of those folks are probably pretty good, and hopefully there's some of them on here and can help us answering some of the questions folks have. If we look at the overall local governments, 247, as I said, 63 of them do the three or more. So, okay, 654 projects. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to have you folks tell me what kind of projects you've done with federal aid. Okay, so bridges, roads, safety, roundabouts, one or two words to describe the kind of projects you've done with federal aid. They'll show up in little boxes in quotes, so you could do more than one word. It's okay. We're not doing a wordle. We have a couple of wordles, but okay. We have trails, roads, bridges, culverts, okay? And they're going to move around. Somebody actually did work on a state highway. I see people putting into the Q&A a trail connection, bridges and roads, sidewalks. Okay. Yep. Street reconstruction. Okay. The federal aid may actually just be an enhancement on a local projects where you're just getting federal aid to enhance an existing project. Obviously, some of the most important ones are some of the Bridge New York funds that have come down the pike lately to help us with our bridge systems that are being funded partially with state aid. And of course, there's a lot of federal aid projects that get onto the State Transportation Improvement Program, or STIP. Okay, so cool. Okay, so as you can see, these are the kind of projects that we could be having. And I'm going to scroll down here just to see if my little scrolling thing will work. It worked in practice. Yeah, Psap, Pedestrian Safety Action Plan, if for those who are wondering what Psap stands for. Intersections, some building renovations, the other ways to get federal aid for building. It's probably not going to fall into Title 23 highways, but all kinds of things can be done with federal aid. Okay, so we can't really cover every single project. That's not the scope of this particular workshop. But what we can do is sort of put in the back of your mind two projects, and we'll go through those two projects over the course of the 3 days, mostly today, but even some of the other 2 days, because they're by far the most common projects that you see with federal aid and highways. One is we'll call it a bridge. Now that bridge could be a girder, it could be arch like you see here, it could be a truss. Just want you to think about the kind of projects that might be involved with bridges, because a lot of you listed bridges. It could even just be rehab. Again, depends on whether it's even eligible for federal aid. And then the other one to sort of keep in the back of your mind is the safety improvement. That safety improvement could be putting in traffic calming or something with the Americans with Disabilities Act. It could be widening. It could be even a congestion issue, but something that's got more of a road flavor to it. Usually safety seems to be the driver for a lot of these projects. About 75 to 80% of the local projects we looked at fell into one of these two broad categories of structures and safety. Okay, so we'll keep those in mind as we go through the course of the 3 days. Now, if you go on the web and you do a little searching around, you can find this large chart that is on the web, the state put together, and it looks almost like a game of life kind of thing with little arrows and buttons and all that fun stuff. It's actually pretty good to review, which is why we threw it into your handout. But I know what a lot of you are thinking right now. I'm going to read your mind, and most of you are thinking the font is too small, I can't read it. And I'm going to just say, don't try to read it. Figures on the web, it's in your handout. Okay, so please don't try to read this figure now, but look at it later on. It actually is useful to understand the whole process, especially when there's federal aid involved. Okay, and it can actually help you later on. Now, there's a federal aid flowchart that FHWA puts together, and it looks like this. Okay, and you're thinking, boy, it looks a lot different than the one from the New York State Department of Transportation. Well, it is, I'll admit that, but it actually is very similar if you think about it and you start breaking it down. It's essentially 5 major project steps, okay? Planning, scope, design, construction, operations, and maintenance, okay? So we start with the planning process and we work our way down to operations and maintenance. So if we go back and we look at our big chart and sort of fuzz it up so we don't have all that text in the way, you can break it down. They did it by color, but obviously some of you may not be able to tell the color. So look at it this way. Planning is the starting point. We got to plan it, get it into our overall plans. We've got to scope out what we're actually going to do. We don't want to have scope creep. We've got to design everything we just put together in the scoping process. We got to build it, construct it. That's what the focus of this workshop is. And then once it's constructed, it falls into operations and maintenance. And you can do the same thing with the federal aid one that the FHWA put together. You can apply the same characteristics, okay? Planning, scoping, design, construction, operations, and maintenance. Now, they call slightly different wording, programming versus scoping, and they don't have operations and maintenance. Why don't you think Federal Highway Administration in their own flowchart ends with operations and maintenance? In the Q&A, can somebody tell me why theirs ends with audits rather than ending with operations and maintenance? Can someone tell me in the Q&A why we're not seeing operations and maintenance when Federal Highway has their own flowchart? Very good. Gina got it. Once it's built, they're done. Their process, the federal aid process, is to make sure things are done in a specific way. And so either the local government or the state government, they're the ones who do the operations and maintenance. Federal aid's job is to audit it, make sure it was done under federal regulations and rules, and we'll talk quite a bit about that. But once they're done with the audit process, they move right back into planning and get going again. Okay, so they're not doing the maintenance. There is an exception, by the way. Federal Highway Administration does actually have an arm that would go to operation maintenance for some roads they maintain through the federal highway land system. Federal lands does maintain quite a bit of roads. If you've ever been to a national park or forest, you may actually be on a federal lands road. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to go through each of these processes. Again, we did that with the webinar a few weeks ago, but I want to also add a few details as we go through this process. So we're going to go back to our 2 projects, our bridge project and our safety project, and you keep those in mind, okay? Now, when you're doing planning, this is where you develop things on the State Transportation Improvement Program, or STIP, okay? Everybody's familiar with the STIP, okay? This is where MPOs are involved, okay? And we do have, I know, at least one MPO on here today. Metropolitan Planning Organization. They set overall plans in addition to and in parallel with the STIP. And then you also hear just sometimes it's referred to as the TIP, which is the Transportation Improvement Program. Those can be done by anybody. Those could be done by locals if you wanted to. You could have something. A federal highway can do those. You can have tribes do those as well. You add a letter in front to say who's doing the work. And of course, this is where you develop your long range plans. You look way out into the future. Okay. Now, how long out do you need to be looking? Well, you probably need to have projects in each of the 5 steps. And so you probably need to be planning at least 2 or 3 times longer than it takes you to actually build the project or take it from project inception to construction. Okay. And by the way, in this process, you're going to have public meetings. And we'll talk more about public meetings here in just a minute. So how long does it take your agency or your organization to take a project from the inception to the construction? If I said to you, I want to do project A, a bridge, or project B, some kind of safety project, how long would it take you from starting until you were finished? Let's see what everybody says here. And in the Q&A, I've got a few. I've got 3 to 4. I've got a couple of 1 to 2s. I've got a couple of more than 5s. Okay, good. Okay, 3 to 4. Okay. So almost nobody has a project less than a year. Okay, most of you are 3 to 4, and there's a sort of a bell-shaped curve. That's pretty much what you would expect. Okay, it's not surprising. But that really means you need to be planning probably out 6 to even 10 years down the road, thinking about what you're going to be doing to get things into the pipeline, get them into the queue. And by the way, if you do that, it also means that you've got projects available if money comes along, like Bridge New York funds, or if Federal Highway Administration is looking at a new infrastructure bill. If suddenly there's money available, they're probably going to be looking for projects that are ready to be designed, that have gotten past the scoping phase. And so you really need to be beyond just the beginning, the inception part of the processes. And federal aid will take longer than a completely local project because you've got a lot more procedures you've got to go through, you've got more approvals to go through, and we'll talk about the whys behind that. There is a why. You may not agree with all of them, but there is a good why behind we're doing that. Okay? So let's then talk about scoping. Okay? Now, scoping is really critical. In fact, if anything, this is the place where we can make or break a project. Okay? And something I want to make sure you keep in mind, and that's real easy to do. It happens to all of us, and we have all seen it happen. It's something called scope creep, where we want to replace the bridge, or we want to put in a roundabout, or we want to do a trail from point A to point B. And then while we're developing our plans, we keep adding to the scope and more, and we just create all this extra stuff, some of which doesn't really help the project and can take a huge amount of time. So be very careful about scope creep, okay? Scoping is where we would be doing, especially for roadway projects, corridor studies. Do you need to bring in a consultant to study that corridor and make sure you've got everything covered? By the way, be careful. You may have to have a different consultant for the scoping phase than the design phase. You have to be very careful how you do the paperwork for that. And again, you're probably going to want to have some kind of public meetings, and you may have to loop back to planning. You may realize after you've scoped it a little bit, I really don't have the money I need. This is the place to set your budget before you go out and try to get your money. You want to do it here and you want to have a good scope, and don't shortchange yourself. Make sure you got plenty of money. Better to have too much money than too little. Um, and we'll talk about what's eligible for federal aid funds. A lot of times people cut themselves short at the wrong time here. This is also where you would be obtaining your design consultant. If you're going to hire someone from outside, or if you're going to decide to do it inside, you would do that during the scoping phase. Okay? So what I want to do is I want to do a scope exercise. What I'd like to do, we did the bridge thing in the last project. So what I'd like to do this time is I'd like to do a safety project. So in the polev.com David Orr PE page, put in what you might include in a scope for a intersection safety improvement. So we're going to do an intersection safety improvement today. So what would you put in for a scope? What would you want to include? You've got to do a survey, yes. Ramps, possibly if it's a interchange. Okay, you got to do a traffic analysis. So traffic is going to start showing up as an important word. Right of way. Ooh, I see somebody's put right of way in here. You at least need to know what you need for right of way. You need to start developing costs. You've got to do counts. Okay. You've got to develop, why do you need signals? What do you have about work zone traffic control? What properties are involved? What drainage are you dealing with? Are there crossings on the roadway? Okay. What's going to be your improvements? Bicycles. This is just one project. If you think about how quickly the scope can grow on you, and it can get out of control really fast if you're not careful. So, something to keep in the back of your mind as you're developing your scope is what's most important. In a safety project, traffic tends to be a dominant player. And by the way, that's what we're seeing in our results. But we got to look at everything else from what do we own? What are the right of ways? What public involvement is there? Is there railroads I see in the list? ADA? Uh, do you have to deal with tribes? Who owns the land? How do you coordinate everything? Yeah. So you can imagine building this scope up. One of the things I would recommend to everybody, and I like to do it myself, is go through the whole project on paper. The better you can write it out ahead of time, think it out, the better off you're going to be. If you want to do it on a whiteboard, go for it. Okay. So if you can't get into polev.com because you don't have access, just put it into the Q&A and I'll include it in the thoughts that we're giving to people. Okay. So if for some reason polev isn't working for you over the next 3 days, the Q&A is working. The chat is not. The chat has been disabled. Okay, so that's a good example of why scope is very important and how quickly scope can get out of control. I just want you to keep that in mind as we go through the course of any project. Make sure you've got it set up properly. Then we're going to go to design. Now the design phase is, you know, pretty important, but hopefully by the time we get to the design phase, we have a pretty good idea of what we really want to do. Our scope should be pretty well set here. Now, in the design phase is where we're going to finalize a whole bunch of pretty critical items, including any environmental reviews. Okay. Now you'll hear something people call it seeker. Um, SEQR. Does anybody know what seeker stands for? And I'd really like to know why we pronounce it that way because the Q to me should be a harder sound. But what is SEQR? See if somebody in the Q&A can tell me what seeker is. State Environmental Quality Review. Yeah. It's a process to make sure we've not missed something in terms of environmental issues. The sooner you can get to that, the smoother it will actually go. Okay. Usually, most of the people get in trouble with seeker issues is because they've already started digging or they've already started down the process and they really haven't thought about the environmental issues that are involved. And you have to do a seeker in most federal aid projects. You have to look at the National Environmental Policy Act, sometimes called NEPA. Okay. And then, of course, you have to do right of way. I'll come back to right of way in just a second. And at the end of the process is where you develop your plans, your specifications, and your estimates, or PS&E. Okay. But that's the end of this process right before you're going to be going out to bid and getting your plans finalized. Okay. So PS&E is sort of the result. It's the product at the end of the design phase. This is also, by the way, where you need to apply for most of your permits because you and I both know permits don't come quick. They take time. So this is where you've got to be sure you've got your permits in place and including all of the stuff for the SEQR, but DEC, do you need a permit? Do you need to work with utilities? Things like that. All of that is done in the design phase before you actually go to construction. Now let's talk a little bit about right-of-way. Right-of-way is very critical on a federal aid project. You have to have right-of-way properly documented. Otherwise, you get yourself in some big trouble. Okay. One of the great things about the local system here in New York State, if you're on a town road, a village street, and even a county road that used to be a village, used to be a town road. So if you're on a county highway that used to be a town highway, you can get a road by use or a street by prescription. And what that says essentially is the right of way is defined by what's been used by the public for 10 or more years, and in the case of towns and counties, has been maintained by the agency for that same 10 or more year period. There's been a positive acceptance of the roadway by the agency. Now, the case law that goes with this is long, but I can tell you right now, if there's any questions, you're going to really need to go out and get a deed. You need a piece of paper, okay, filed somewhere that you can use to define the right of way. Don't assume. So This particular photograph, I just was going through my files. I have no idea what the actual right-of-way on this particular roadway is. Okay. But if you were going to be replacing that bridge using federal aid, and it turns out it's a road by use, not a deeded section of highway, what do you think the right-of-way is defined by in that particular photograph? So again, in the Q&A, somebody tell me what defines the right-of-way there. What defines the right-of-way in that particular photograph of the bridge? The toe of slope, if there is a slope, very likely the toe is slope, okay? But there's an exception. I can actually see it on the right side of the photograph, okay? The rail, the rail is almost assuredly, that's the one we can also all agree on. The rail, the back side of the guide rail is definitely a positive action by the agency. So certainly the rail and the anchors at the end, yeah, no doubt about that. The toe slope you would think would define it, but see that tree behind the weight limit sign? That tree is a fixed object. And that means that nobody's maintained and kept that tree out of the possible clear zone spot. So the right of way is probably the front side of that tree on a road by use. You let a tree grow up to where it's no longer just a small brush. You really haven't done maintenance, you could lose that right of way. And by the way, in that case, it only takes 6 years. But it also means that bridge itself, you may have no right of way past literally the edge of the vertical face where the edge of the structure is. So if you needed to widen it, you'd have to go get a deed. So keep that in mind. You really need the right of way. Now, as we were developing this, I got some plans from different groups, and I just want to talk a little bit about some of these issues. Now, preliminary survey has been done, and we're gonna purposely today define HAB as the approximate highway boundary. I don't care if it's the actual highway boundary, as a lot of people say. I just purposely want to say this is an approximate one the surveyor did because it looked like it might be a street by use. Okay, so today we're just going to say that's what the surveyor sort of noted based upon a road with 3 rods, but it's a road by or street by use or street by prescription. Okay. So I want you to notice there's some sidewalks on here, and I'm going to highlight those sidewalks for you in yellow just because it's a little easier to see. Okay. So there's the 2 sidewalks. Okay. And as you can see, if we put back on the approximate boundary lines on top, okay, that's based on an assumption of, in this case, we're just assuming a 3-rod roadway, which is the most common for town roads especially. Okay. The one sidewalk is probably inside that assumed edge of the sidewalk boundary. But look at the one on the left. The sidewalk is actually outside even the assumed highway boundary. So what is, if this is a highway by use or a street by prescription, where is the actual boundary of the right of way? Does anybody want to take a guess and a gather what defines the edge of the right of way here in this particular case? What defines it? The edge of the sidewalk, the back of the sidewalk. Okay, a lot of people are putting back of sidewalk, edge of sidewalk. Okay. If there's a curb and it's a curb and gutter system, the front curb would certainly be in there because it's part of the drainage, no doubt about that. Okay, but it's pretty clear there's a roadway, there's some grass, and then there's a sidewalk. Okay, I'd love to say the back of the sidewalk define the right of way. The problem is a sidewalk is not a highway purpose under highway law in New York State. And so that back of that sidewalk may or may not define the right of way. And if the assumed or even a deeded right of way runs down the middle of that sidewalk, you may not have the right to replace that sidewalk. It may actually be outside the right of way because just because it's maintained by the village or maintained by the town or the county doesn't make it a highway purpose. A highway purpose has to be a road, a stormwater issue, safety related things like that. And the sidewalks are not defined as part of the highway in a lot of cases, especially in the town system. Okay. So it can get to be a bit of a challenge. And I'm only touching on right of way. We could spend the whole day talking about right of way. Okay? So be very careful about right-of-ways. Don't assume anything. Okay? Let's look at another one. Okay? Now we've done a detailed survey. Okay? We're going to assume a deeded survey in this case. We've got a much more detailed survey, the kind of survey you'd be doing in the scoping phase or early in the design phase, where you're trying to finalize everything. Okay? But in this case, if you look at the deeds, the right-of-ways aren't where you might think they should be. Here's the 2 sidewalks. Okay? We're going to mark the sidewalks on here. And we're going to mark the location of the boundary based on the deeds. In this case, they're blue. Okay? So you notice the 2 blue lines, one at the top and one at the bottom. What do you notice about the bottom sidewalk? Anybody notice? It should be pretty clear. What do you notice about that bottom sidewalk? It's outside. Yeah, it's not in the right-of-way. So if part of your project was to improve the sidewalks, it's a safety improvement. You don't have a right to touch that sidewalk. It's outside the right-of-way, and you're going to have to get right-of-way to work on it before the project gets into construction phase. You really need to be doing that sooner. You may even have to go back to scoping to set and figure that out. Okay? So you do not want to get to plans and specifications at this point. You really need to figure out, do you have your scope right, and do you need to acquire some right-of-way to include that sidewalk, to make sure it's included in the project, because the road just happened to be shifted on the deeds, and that happens a lot. Don't assume. When I bought the house I live in, everybody assumed the property was halfway between me and my neighbors. It turns out it's actually only 2 feet from their garage. Wouldn't be allowed today, but now the house is there and the garage is there, and you got to deal with the reality. Don't assume. Okay? One more on right-of-way. I just want to make sure you understand, because it causes an awful lot of issues when it comes to projects. And again, we'll do the same thing. I'll highlight the sidewalk for you. Okay? There's a building on the left where all those station marks are. I didn't fill in all the stuff around the building. I just put the main sidewalk. But notice the right-of-way line. Okay? There's one part of it, and there's the other part of it. The right-of-way actually winds up going into a paved roadway. Now, if it was a deeded or road by or street by use, would it make a difference? Well, in this case, actually it might. The liability is very different. If you own that land where that building is on the left, bottom left corner, in a deeded situation, you actually picked up some liability. But if it's a street by use or road by use, the municipality may actually have at least the responsibility up to the edge of that sidewalk. You see projects like this, stop, step back, figure out who's going to have responsibility when the project is done. You get yourself in trouble if you're not sure. And what you don't want to do is eventually become part of the Atlas Obscura and something like the Hess Estate. If you're ever down in New York City, you can actually find this location. It's down in Greenwich Village area, and it's a piece of property that was never dedicated for public purposes. When they widened some of the streets down there and they put in different projects, and you can read about it, it's pretty cool. They failed to take this little triangle of property, and the guy who owned it, Hess, he made it clear it was never going to fall in the hands of the city. And so there's this little bitty piece of property which has never been dedicated for public purposes. It's in front of a doorway entrance. We don't want problems like that. Okay. So again, take your time with right-of-way. It's pretty important. Um, that can solve a lot of your issues if you make sure you know who's got the responsibility and what is involved. Now, I want to talk a little bit about public meetings. I see a lot of people do public meetings. There are some formal requirements for some public meetings. So I want to make sure you understand, I am a big fan of what I call information gatherings. Maybe not so much a formal meeting. A public information meeting has a specific set of criterion behind it. But an information gathering where you gain information from people can be extremely valuable. Now, we're talking about design right now. It may go back all the way to planning or scoping. Meet people at their own place a local school, a local fire hall. Obviously, with COVID, we've got restrictions, so maybe you do this via the internet. There's a lot of stuff about virtual public involvement. The timing on that from Federal Highway couldn't be better. You can just search on the web for virtual public involvement, ways to get feedback from people and get their ideas. And I can tell you right now, if you can gather ideas from the public early on, include some of those ideas in the scope, you'll get a lot of buy-in, you'll get champions from the public, and they'll actually support you. So take your time. Public meetings are well worth it. And in almost every phase, you probably need to have some kind of public information meeting or information gathering session. Try to be informal when you can, and when you have to be formal, be formal. But be respectful of everybody there and have good ways for feedback. Okay? Now we're going to move into construction. This you finished up, you've got your PS&E done. Okay? And we're going to talk about construction. Okay? Construction is where you're going to do the contract letting, you're going to do your award, you're going to build the project out, and then you're going to do the closeout. And that's what really we're going to be focused on for the rest of the time we are together over these next 3 Tuesdays, is really the construction phase of the process. But I want you to understand how this fits into an overall project. Just to make sure we're all on the same page to get started, we're going to do another poll EV. I want you to tell me, based on the projects, and a lot of you have done many of them, what kind of projects do you expect to see or have seen during the construction phase? What have you come across that's an issue? And we're going to do another Wordle. Sometimes we'll do what they call text boxes. Sometimes we'll do a Wordle. I just want to see what you come up. Put in multiple words. What's cool about it, if you put in hazardous material and somebody else puts in drainage material, material will pop up. So that's what's sort of cool about Wordles. It doesn't always work on everything. But let's see what you come up with. And I've got in the Q&A, I've got a utility interference, and utilities is in here. Okay, yep. Let's see what else we get. Weather, yeah, weather is an issue. We certainly need to think about weather. The concept of the unforeseen, okay. Overruns, owner issues, property issues. As this Wordle is growing, I want you to look at the number of things on here and ask yourself, are they construction issues? Are they actually things that belonged over in scoping or in design? Or they maybe even go all the way back to the planning process. For instance, I see right-of-way on here. I see utilities pop up all the time. What could we have done before we started the project to not have these problems during construction? Could we have spent a little bit of extra funds doing a little bit more work during scoping or design to find these problems? A subsurface investigation in the design or even scoping phase might have solved a lot of these problems. Okay? And yes, they are eligible to be reimbursed if you can show that they're part of the overall project. You've got to document this, but can very well pay for itself. And it's certainly something you want to think about. Okay? So look at some of the other ones that are on here that have come up. Let's see, did anybody put in here ADA? I'm surprised. ADA comes up a lot. When we were talking with DOT about problems, a lot of problems came up with ADA. Let's see, quality assurance, quality control. That should be on your list. A lot of the problems you'll see come up with that. You get angry businesses. I like that. Yep. Material certifications. I see certifications on here. That's good. Okay. And then inspection issues. A lot of these problems, if you think about it, are inspection issues, okay, that come up. Yep, there's ADA. I see it now. Okay. So keep that in mind as we go through this. We're going to try to cover a lot of these, but where do these problems really fit? You've got tree issues. Is that really a construction issue, or should that have been taken care of in the design phase or even the scoping phase? I see lead on here, for instance. Do you have a lead or asbestos problem? And when should that have been taken care of? Okay. It's usually worth it to spend the time up front to figure out what the problems are going to be when the project starts. Not always possible, but think about what you could do early to eliminate a lot of these problems. Okay. And then finally, operations and maintenance. We sometimes forget about this. It's something we really need to be thinking about all through back in planning. Because if you've got a good construction process, your operations and maintenance actually gets easier and is cheaper in the long run because you don't have to spend as much time on operations and maintenance. It comes back to think about buying a car. If we could, we want to buy a car that's got very low operations and maintenance costs, that we know when we turn the key, it's going to start and it gets good gas mileage. It's cheaper to run. But usually that means you got to spend more money up front, i.e. construction. The what are you going to be able to afford kind of thing. Same thing is true with projects we're building, whether it's our bridge or whether it's our problem with our safety issue that we've got. What we'd really like to do is have an operations and maintenance plan as part of the design process so that when people build a project, they know we're going to be in pretty good shape. Okay? So what I'm going to do, we're going to do one more poll here. You've built projects. We talked about problems during construction. What are the biggest issues with your new projects? You finished the project. What's your biggest issue you got to deal with? What kind of things are you now having as a headache in operations and maintenance? And there's no more federal aid. You've closed the project out. Plowing. Yeah, you got to take care of it in the winter. You got to deal with the landscaping issues to deal with. Okay. Cracking, whether it's concrete, asphalt, you don't have a warranty. By the way, we'll let you know with federal aid, there's no warranty with some limited exceptions. Okay. Public complaints. That's why we like public meetings to get them involved. Funding, that long-term maintenance cost. Drainage issues. Uh, Drainage is our biggest issue. You know, I love to see drainage, and drainage. You got to mow it. You got to maintain it. You get bridge deck cracking. I see someone in the Q&A put O&N, ADA ramps not constructed correctly. Yep. You didn't do training because there's some process that changes for your operations and maintenance. The design didn't actually address the problem. You've got problems with agencies, cooperation, whether it's a town with village or county with a town. People are hitting the guide rail that you just put up. Utility issues, even after you've done the project. Yeah. Okay. As you're going through, earlier is better, but think about all the construction problems that you're dealing with. And the sooner you can take care of that, the better off you're going to be. Okay. Because at the end of the day, and I love to say that phrase, I say it probably too often, it does come back to helping out the public and what the costs are. Okay. And of course, we have to pay for that. There's a cost involved. Okay. So back to our construction scoping and things like that. This is where we are. This is not a fixed, we're done with O&M. It really is a cycle that we're going to go through here. Okay, we're going to come back. We're going to do planning. We're going to do scoping. And we may loop back at any particular time in here. We're going to focus on construction, but really want to do is just do a project. So we're going to do a quick project together. Okay. Now, we're going to be taking our first break here in just a few minutes. So we're not going to finish this particular project. Okay. We're going to do a project exercise. And last time, if you were on the webinar, we did a dessert. We're going to do a little more complicated project, and it's we're going to do dinner. Okay. My mom always said the hardest thing about making dinner wasn't the preparation of the food. The building, the construction of the dinner was fine. It was figuring out what we were going to have for dinner, making sure we had everything we needed for dinner, and figuring out how to put it together. The actual cooking was the easy part. So what I want to do is a project exercise. And if we're going to make dinner, okay, we're going to start here, and we'll do a quick project exercise on what's involved with making dinner, and then we're going to take our first break. Okay? So if you're going to have dinner, you're going to plan out your dinner, okay? You got to pick your ingredients. Do you have the groceries in stock? What do people want? What are they actually going to eat? Is everything clean? You know, oops, I don't have any dishes. Yep, good. What's the recipe you're going to actually use? That's probably a scoping issue, if you think about it. Are people on diets? Do people have gluten issues or they have diabetes and you got to be careful what you feed them? Are there allergies? You know, some people are allergic to soy. Some love soy. Okay. Who's coming? Is it a formal dinner? Is it just some pizza night? Okay. Is the stove clean? Yeah. Do you have the seasonings? Are those seasonings so old that they're Paleolithic in nature? Yeah. I like that one. Do you have your fire extinguisher set? That sounds like a minor thing, but if you need it, you better know where it is and is it going to work? Okay. Okay. How many people are going to be involved? Do you want to have leftovers? That's part of the operation maintenance. My wife and I do a lot of meals where we purposely have leftovers. We love that idea. But that's a part of the scoping and how long you're going to have it. Okay. Now, this all sounds like pretty minor stuff. And this is just making a meal. And look at all the issues that have come up. Silverware. Do we need to have white tablecloths? Are we just eating in the living room on trays? Are we outside with the grill? Oh, does the grill have propane? Has the surface been cleaned, or is nobody going to want to eat it? Okay. If you think about this same process when it comes to your own road and highway projects, you'll be in good shape. Scope it out. Write down all the ideas. Do a brainstorming session. Just have people throw things out, even things you aren't going to be able to do, and then develop your plans, set your final scope, and that really will help you when the design and construction phases come along. And you're doing all of these things when you make dinner. You really probably should be doing all of these exact same things when you're developing a project, spending federal dollars or even your own local dollars. Okay. So, with that, keep these things in mind. We're going to be coming back to them. Okay. We're going to go ahead and take our first break. Okay. And I got to make sure I do this. I always have to remember. Okay. There we go. Watch this trick. See if this works here. It did work just fine. So we're going to come back at 9:45. I have a question for you. I'm going to answer it right after the break is over. What is the single most important thing we need to be thinking about when it comes to not just federal aid projects, but all of our highway and road projects? What's the single most important thing we need to be thinking about? And with that, we'll take a 15-minute break and we'll see you all at a quarter off. Okay. We'll be starting up again in about 3 minutes. About 3 minutes, we'll be starting up again. We'll be starting up again in a little over a minute. Okay, good morning. And we're coming back from our session. And we'll get started again with the next part of our construction contract administration class. And I asked a question before we left about what was the most important single item. I had somebody put in the Q&A pod what they thought the answer was. Let's see if somebody else, what is the single most important thing we need to be thinking about to make our project successful? Put in the Q&A pod what you think that is. Okay. I'm gonna let a few answers come in here. Not tell you what people wrote, but then I'll go through those. Okay, so we have a few answers in here. We have someone who put the costs, the scope. We have the users, the people involved. Yeah, that's a pretty good one. Yeah. Okay. The end user. Yeah, I think that's a good. So, if you're wondering, the question is, what is the single most important thing that's going to lead to good success in our federal projects? Public safety. Okay, can't argue about that one. Cost. Budget. Does it solve the problem? What is the goal? Do you have the right of way? Quality, longevity, process? Is it needed? All great answers. Okay, but I'm going to give you mine. And the most important thing I think that solves most of our issues, and when we talk to folks with the state DOT, and I do need to give a shout out to Dave McEwen, who's with the Binghamton office, it really came down to one simple factor, and that is we need to communicate. And if you've got a problem, keep communicating. If you're not sure what the problem is, communicate some more. Pick up the phone, send out an email, talk um, sooner rather than later. If you see a problem, don't wait. Pick up the phone, or drop an email to somebody, and communicate. So we're going to talk a lot about that, and we're going to be coming back to that again and again as a theme. All the money in the world won't solve our problem if we don't communicate the problem. And most of the issues that we were given when we asked folks for their biggest problems came back to a failure to communicate early and solve the problem before it became a big one. So communication is going to be key. Now we're going to be focusing on chapter 15 of the Local Projects Manual. Okay. In your handout, there's a link that's available. You can also just search for Local Projects Manual Chapter 15, Administer Construction Contracts. We're going to be spending a lot of time talking about that. Um, we've already talked a little bit about the introduction to project management. We'll be doing more of that quite a bit during the course of today. Next Tuesday, we're going to be spending most of the time on the construction supervision, the construction management plan, some of the administration and documentation stuff, and we'll be finishing with the monitoring and closeout. And we're going to try to go through the listing, as it were. Okay, if you open up the chat pod, you'll get a link to the handout for the workshop, and then there's a link to all the things we're talking about, and we'll be showing some of them during the course of the day. So you can actually link the download for the handout. Okay, so you open up the chat pod and it should show up there. Now, as you read through the chapter 15, actually, if you read through almost all of the stuff that's put out via the Local Projects Manual and then the other federal manuals that we're talking about during this thing, you're going to come across acronyms. We probably use too many of these acronyms, but it's shorthand. We're trying to shorten things up. Heck, our program, we go by New York State LTAP Center. Well, that actually stands for Local Technical Assistance Program, and has a long history going back to when it was Rural Technical Assistance Program. But we tend to all use some form of acronyms in our daily business. We don't call it Federal Highway Administration every time. We call it FHWA. We don't call it New York State Department of Transportation. We call it NYSDOT. So acronyms are valuable, but there is the danger of that acronym minefield. So on one of the pages in your handout, I've listed some of the most common acronyms. I've not listed by any stretch all of them. But if you start to go through and learn those acronyms and are able to recognize them when you see them, and I'll be honest, I still don't recognize all of them when I see them, it really goes a long way to understanding the whole process, and you start to get a flavor for what needs to be done. So we're going to go through, we're going to be talking about acronyms. We're going to ask you questions about acronyms. Just keep that in mind, and we'll be coming back to that again and again. Now, what I want to spend quite a bit of time on now is talking about roles and responsibilities. And these are roles of the Federal Highway Administration, the federal government, New York State, specifically the New York State Department of Transportation, and what is known in all the paperwork as the sponsor. And we'll come back to what that means here in just a little bit. Realize that together we do better than we do alone. Anybody who's ever made cinnamon rolls, a different spelling, but still the same sound, hominin, knows that if you put the rolls together in the pan, they rise up further than if they're isolated and further apart. And so to make the project as successful as possible, we all need to be working together so we can rise up as much as possible and make ourselves a good doughy surface for our sweet project that we're doing on top of it. So what I'm going to do is go through first individually the groups and then talk about the joint responsibilities a little bit from each of the agencies. So we're going to start with Federal Highway Administration. Federal Highway Administration is part of the U.S. Department of Transportation, and it has a specific responsibility. Now, this is something from one of the slides they sent us. I'm going to read it to you. I try not to do that very often, but this one I want to read because it's one that was repeated quite often in a presentation that I heard FHWA give. So I want to make sure you understand this one. The role and responsibility of Federal Highway Administration is to ensure recipients of federal aid deliver the program, which includes project delivery, i.e. construction, in an efficient effective, and compliant manner with federal requirements. So they really have a three-pronged purpose. They want to be efficient, they want to be effective, but they have to make sure we're compliant. And I know this is probably where most of us are probably rolling our eyes in the back of our heads and going, spend way too much time on compliance. But they have to look at all three, and compliance does drive a lot of what they do. So if you're wondering why they're focused on certain things, they have to do all three. Okay? So keep that in mind as we're going through this. Now, as I said, Federal Highway Administration is part of the U.S. Department of Transportation. Secretary of Transportation is Pete Buttigieg. Secretary Pete, I guess he's going by since he was Mayor Pete before. And the acting administrator for Federal Highway Administration is a lady by the name of Stephanie Pollock, which is interesting. We have a similar name for our university president here. She's the acting administrator for Federal Highway, but it goes back from all the way up there down to the division level. So roles and responsibilities, there are people at federal headquarters out of Washington, D.C. that get involved, but generally 99% of the time you're going to be dealing with State Department of Transportation, who deals with the New York Division. So if you hear the term division, and this is one of the acronyms and definitions on your sheet, division means federal highway at the state level. You know, if they called it the New York State Office or the New York Office, that could be confusing with, is that New York State DOT? Is it New York City DOT? It can be confusing. So what they've done in each state, there's a division office. So when you hear the division office, it's the Federal Highway Administration's office within a particular state. So in this state, it's NY. So the New York Division Office is the state of New York. Okay. And now that office has different programs and offices within it. There's an Office of Engineering, there's an Office of Program Management, there's Finance and Administration. Those are the primary ones that get involved in federal aid projects. There are within that people called area engineers. We'll talk more about them quite a bit. There's folks involved with civil rights, environment. There's safety, bridges, pavements and materials, and right of way. And I will not make any claims that I have these people in their right office. Uh, I'm borrowing this slide from somebody else. Okay. So, yes, Office of Engineering does include civil rights and environment. And the Office of Program Management includes bridges, pavements, materials, and right of way. That's how they've organized their structure. So, my advice is if you're not sure, don't assume. Pick up the phone, send out an email, communicate, get the right people involved. Now, in terms of that responsibility, we're going to talk mostly about the division. Their primary role on most federal projects is actually surprisingly first. You may not believe it, but it is first, and actually have enough evidence and have talked to them on plenty of things. I actually believe this. Their first role is technical assistance. Okay? Their first and primary role is to help out agencies, mostly through the DOT, with technical assistance to help make sure they've answered the questions that need to be answered. Now, that may be technical assistance on the process, but it's still technical assistance. But they also have a lot of people to help with safety and bridges and pavements and other more what we would call engineering technical assistance. They are working with New York State Department of Transportation on the local projects. To do this, they have to conduct reviews. And it goes back to that idea of stewardship and oversight. That's a pretty important role that they play within the overall process. So keep that in mind as we're going through. That's what they're going back to. Now, they rely a lot on the New York State Department of Transportation. Okay? They really need to make sure that things are done in a particular way. What were the three words I said were important? That the FHW has the responsibility to ensure local sponsors deliver its projects in what kind of manner? What are the three words? See if in the Q&A you can tell me what the three words were. Efficient, got efficient, that's good. There should be two more words. I know we can get them. Effective, I'm looking for one more, and compliant. Yeah, those three words pretty much go together. Okay, so keep that in mind. That's what their role and responsibility is. And the way they do that in the field, okay, they don't have field engineers, they have area engineers. They cover an area within a particular state. And they are the primary project contact with or for New York State DOT. So New York State DOT goes the federal highway through the area engineer most of the time. And their primary focus is on risk. Now, risk can be safety risk could be financial risk, but areas of risk. Okay? Now, just because they're trying to meet those three criterion of efficiency, effectiveness, and compliance, they are mostly procedures focused. Okay? That's just the nature of the job. To do this properly, they have to have an awareness of the project status, its issues, where does it stand, how does it fit within the plan, is it on schedule, behind schedule, okay? And they also are watching to make sure that there's no technical or computational issues that are being violated or that there's a problem, okay? So if there's an issue, DOT will bring it up and go get some technical assistance from Federal Highway Administration. So let's say there's a paving issue and it's something that the state's not quite sure about. The FHW exists to help there, but they'll go through the area engineer to find that help. Okay. So just something to keep in mind. The FHW area engineer is pretty important in that particular area. Okay. Now there's plenty of people back at the division office to help beyond that, but that person is the primary. Now, part of the stewardship and oversight, FHWA, they'll go up the high elevation, they'll look over the project like looking over the valley, and they're going to be looking at all federal aid projects, and they break them down into different categories. They're called projects of division interest, and they love it's another acronym. Today's acronym list includes PODI, P-O-D-I, okay? So a PODI means a project of division interest, and they break all federal aid projects into one of these categories. Okay. Now, what those essentially go back to is that idea of the area engineer and risk. Okay. The bigger the project, the more risk, the higher the category. How much involvement is there with the federal aid system? How much does the division get involved in approvals? Okay. So category 2, big projects, you know, the K Bridge, a bridge across the Mohawk, something, large, high risk, safety, large volumes, category 1. Okay. Category 2, not as critical, still important, but they're going to look at the design review and approval. So they're going to get involved pretty early on in the process. They're not going to get involved in scoping and everything, but they are going to be involved in the design long before you get to PS&E. Okay. Category 3, they're just worrying about construction reviews. The DOT takes the lead on all the other reviews, but they're involved in construction. And then very small projects, once they've looked at it and they've approved the federal aid, there's no further federal involvement other than maybe a random audit here and there. Okay. Now, I'm going to go through what the screening criteria are, but in the Q&A pod, what do you think are the most common categories? Okay. 1, 2, 3, or 4. What do you think are the most common of those 4 in terms of federal aid projects? A lot of 2s. Let's see here. What have I got? Got anything other than 2? Everybody lists 2. I got a 3. Almost everybody lists 2. The answer is 1 and 3 are by far the most common, at least here in New York. And 3 would be the most common on local projects. Okay. Now, obviously, there's a lot of big projects at the state level, so category 1 kicks in on a lot of them, but 1 and 3 are by far the most common. Okay. And essentially, it involves with how much level they're going to get involved. So if it's a level 1, they're going to do everything from concurrence to change orders to time extensions, final acceptance, all that stuff. Okay. A local project may be a level 1. A rehab of the Brooklyn Bridge included that. Uh, Work on the K Bridge, as I just mentioned, involves that. Okay. Category 2 is actually not used very often. Generally, either they're going to be involved the whole project or they're just going to be involved in construction reviews. Okay. So category 3 is, multiple construction site visits, safety improvements, small bridge. Pretty likely for local projects, you're going to see construction reviews. Okay. Category 4, not much, not very many of them. Okay. If you're wondering, they once the federal aid is released, they've defined that ahead of time. They've said this is category 1, 2, 3, or 4. They're going to be doing, 5 to 600 projects a year in New York State between all agencies, the state and all the locals. And they're only going to have 40 or 50 that are active that they're really worried about with this category 1 or category 3. So by far 1 and 3 are the most common. For local projects, it's probably going to be category 3. But don't assume, ask the questions ahead of time. And how do they screen? Well, some of the criterion they use, is it on the national highway system? Obviously, if it's a state highway, it's very likely, but not always on the national highway system. But is it on the national highway system? And a lot of the county road system is part of the national highway system as a minor collector or a major collector. Okay. How big is the project? If the project is larger than 25 million downstate, Long Island, New York City, that's going to bump it up to a higher level. If it's more than 10 million for the rest of the state, so big projects. Small projects, probably not going to get bumped up. Is there a need for an environmental impact statement? Okay, that level increases the level of risk. That occurs in scoping. Okay, does it involve the interstate? Which, even if you're not changing the national highway system, if there's access, this is pretty important. Are there tiger grants or special funding behind it? Is there some weird major structure, or is it unique that's only being done once or twice? So therefore, there's a higher level of risk. Okay, and so these are all the kinds of things that they look at. And New York State's division office has sort of developed some terms that they use and levels that they're looking at. Okay. A good way to think about it is the more risk, the more likely they're going to get involved, and it's going to be a PODI level 1. But if it's a small project like a sign replacement, guide rail upgrades, uh, just a minor rehab, maybe even some small ADA projects, probably going to be level 3 is the most common that you're going to see in the local system. Now, in terms of the federal program involvement, there are different things that you're going to come across. We'll talk more about these as we go through, but they have something called the Appliance Assessment Program, again, acronym CAP, where they're checking to make sure that did we meet compliance. They're going to look at the Financial Integrity Review and Evaluation. Yes, acronym is FIRE. And there they're focused on the efficiency and the effectiveness, as well as compliance and did we spend the money properly. They're going to check processes reviews. A lot of that's with DOT, just so you know. But they're still checking processes, and they're checking, did we look at different programs? Are we following the rules that need to be followed? And so it really comes down to looking at these different factors. This is this audit function that sort of ends the federal aid process in a lot of ways. And in terms of where we fit, well, everything comes from the law. That's the top of the pyramid. You could make that the foundation of the pyramid, but the law is the most important. So in this case, we'll put it at the top of the pyramid. It's actually the overall foundation in some respects, but at the top is the law, then regulations, then policies that are set, guidance behind that, and then finally information. There's a lot more of it, so that's another way to think about it. There's a lot more information than there is law. So does somebody have an example they can put in there of a law that you might have to deal with federal aid? What's an example of a law in the Q&A pod? The ADA, yeah, that's a law. There's a law behind that. And by the way, the ADA is now 31 years old. Yeah. The Code of Federal Regulations, CFR 23, highways is the primary law that sets most federal aid rules. Okay. Davis-Bacon, we'll talk a lot more about Davis-Bacon as we go through the requirements in terms of hiring people and wages and things like that. Those are laws. Okay. And there may be state laws involved. Someone put in right of way. Yeah, right of way. That might be a state. Okay, speed limits, things like that. What about a regulation? Give me an example of a regulation that we might have to deal with. And I messed up, by the way. CFR is the regulations, so I gave away one right there. CFR is the regulations under the law. The law for highways is the FAST Act currently. Traffic regulations, the MUTCD. Yeah, okay. Environmental permits, there may be a regulation. Usually there's a law that supports that. I mean, even the MUTCD has a law behind it that specifically says who's setting up the regulations. Yeah. How about policies? Any policies that you've had to deal with? What kind of policies do you have? Do you have your own local policies? Complete streets. Now, there's a good example in the Q&A of somebody who's given something that could be a law, a regulation, and a policy. There actually is a law on complete streets in New York. There are regulations that got derived from that, but people may have the policy of what they do. And the Highway Design Manual has some policies in it that people should follow. Driveway standards are typically policies. So a very common policy that we're dealing with, we call it the Highway Design Manual. It's set up by the New York State Department of Transportation. It's one you should get to know because when you're building things with federal aid, you have to follow the Highway Design Manual or get permission to follow some other standard. So that's a regulation, then to a policy. That's a good policy to follow, even though it's not called one in the rules. What about guidance? What kind of guidance can you think of? What kind of guidance might you have to deal with? It gets a little trickier as we get the Local Projects Manual. Is that a policy or is that a guidance? Okay. I would probably put the Local Projects Manual bumped up. It's almost really a policy because you pretty much have to follow it. The guidance would be supporting documentation that's within it. Okay. So the EIEB system that exists, the engineering instructions, engineering bulletins that somebody put in, that's a really good example of guidance. They sometimes fall over into policy. If it becomes something you have to do, it's a policy issue. But guidance, one that's an example, and we'll talk a lot more about this, is the idea of Buy America. And Buy America requires certain things have to be purchased using American-made products. They've extended that requirement and some of the rules for another few years. That could be guidance on top of a policy. And then finally, information. If you're not sure, these are, a letter that's sent out might come from the FHWA division office, might come from DOT. It's just information to help you with everything else. So keep that in mind if you're not sure. It all comes back to the laws that are involved, okay? In this case, the FAST Act. Now we're going to switch gears and now let's talk a little bit about the New York State Department of Transportation's roles and responsibilities, okay? Now there is the main office, okay? That's where the local projects people are located, in main office in Wolf Road, Albany, okay? And then there are the regional offices, okay? Going around the state, there are 11 regions. And the single most important person within those regions for local projects is, today's acronym is RLPL, okay? What is the RLPL? You'll hear this one a lot, so this is one you probably should know. What's an RLPL? Someone want to put that in the pod for me. The Regional Local Projects Liaison. Yeah, very good. Nice job. Okay, RLPL. Okay, so when you hear that, that is your main contact as a local agency. Okay. Now, the main office has responsibilities. Their primary responsibility is the development, maintenance, and updates to the local projects manual. Okay, all that's available on the web. We're definitely going to go through a lot of that. They answer the questions on federal regulations that come either from the divisions or from the sponsors through the RLPLs. Okay, and they act as liaisons with main office and the different bureaus within main office, with the Federal Highway Administration and the divisions, okay? If there's something that's a larger regional initiative, maybe a corridor work that's being done, or there's some other guidance that comes out, local projects gets involved. We actually got involved with local projects about 3 years ago. We have a set of road standards for very low volume roads. And by the way, if you're wondering, we have a class on that coming up in June on the geometrics and the design thickness. But the geometric side, local projects helped us harmonize our standards we had with the ones in the Highway Design Manual. So they now say the same thing in terms of drainage. Okay. So they act as liaisons and they can be very helpful when there's a conflict. And you might want to get them involved if you have to. Okay. The regional office, that's your primary contact point for local projects. They're going to have offices within the regional office where they've got people who have different levels of expertise. So there's construction people, geotechnical, structures, planning and program management design, and office of environment. I guarantee you won't be able to know all of them. You may need to know one or two of them. When I worked for Yates County, we'd go down to the regional office on a regular basis. I knew very well the people in structures. I knew a bunch of the folks in construction and geotech. I didn't know much about some of the other offices, but I knew they were there. And that's the main thing. You just be aware that there are different offices that can help you with everything from soil testing, financial folks. Go and ask questions. Pick up the phone. And how do you do that? You do that through the RLPL, that Regional Local Project Liaison. Okay? That is the single most important person you need to get to know. Make sure you've met with them, and they're involved in a lot of this stuff with local projects. Okay? Some regions actually have more than one person with that role, and sometimes they have a slightly different title. They might be a design liaison or a construction liaison. They actually separate out the project stuff. But the RLPL is the primary person. And in your handout, okay, and I'm going to see if my computer will wake up. Here we go. You'll actually notice we list right at the very top the list link to the RLPLs. But I can tell you right now, that's a long website. You know how I find the RLPLs? How would you find the RLPLs if I didn't have the handout? And I'll hide the handout so you don't have it. How do I know my regional local project liaison if I don't know who that is? What technique could you use? You could go to the tip. It's usually listed in the tip. Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. If you got a copy of the Transportation Improvement Program, it should have that RLPL listed. Yeah. Just go to the website. Search Google. Search Google. I literally just to confirm it, I actually searched NYSDOT RLPL and up popped that website. And then I clicked to make sure it was active, and that's how I actually put it into the form. So Google's my friend, or Bing if you prefer Bing, or Ask, or whatever search engine you like. They're all pretty good these days. Okay, you could probably ask Siri to do that. Okay, so make sure you communicate with the RLPL. If I had to pick the one person you want to get to know when you're doing a federal aid project, it would be that person. So what are the roles and responsibilities of the RLPL? As you can see, it's a long list. Let's just talk a little bit about some of these. How is the sponsor managing the project? We'll come back to what sponsor is in just a second. Do they have enough folks? I mean, is there enough staff? A lot of small agencies, do they have enough sufficient staff to be able to do the job, or they've hired out enough people to do the job? Are the daily records being maintained? Not just from the standpoint of, is there the daily record, form, but is there information there that's going to be helpful? Is safety a priority, and is it being maintained? How's the housekeeping? Reviewing of change orders, or we'll use a different term here in just a minute. And then, of course, they're involved in final inspection before the final payments are made to make sure everything's been done. And one thing they're not doing, and this, of all the things in this list, maybe the one you want to keep in the back of your mind, they are not validating how you do the work. They don't validate the procedures on how things are done. They don't validate the method of the contractor's operations. They're validating what's been done in the ground and the records behind it. Okay, so if you want a contractor to do something a little different, or they want to do something different, you as the local agency are the ones who are making sure the procedures are done right. The state, through the RLPL, is validating, was the work done to meet the standards, and is it being properly documented? Okay. So again, just to review, how's the sponsor managing the project? Think about that. How are you doing? Do you have enough staff? Probably not. Don't get more. You can get reimbursed. Do you have your daily records being maintained? Critical. Do you have safety as a priority? Housekeeping, change orders, inspection. Okay? That's their role. They're not out there to tell the contractor how to do the particular job. Now, I keep using the word sponsor. The sponsor is the local agency. Okay? So whenever you hear the term or read the term sponsor, that means local agency. If it was the state doing the job, by the way, the sponsor would be the state. It could be a private enterprise. There are some cases for some federal aid where there's actually a private enterprise or a non-government organization, an NGO. In that case, the sponsor would be that NGO. So we have a contract with the State Department of Transportation for the LTAP Center. So we are the sponsor on a federal aid project because there's some federal monies involved. Okay. So when we're talking about federal aid for local projects, we're talking about local agencies, towns, counties, villages, and cities. And in some cases, there are some MPOs involved. Okay. So if you hear the term sponsor, it's the same as a local agency in this case. So what are your roles and your responsibilities? Okay. Well, there's different people involved. They sometimes can be the same. They sometimes can be different. So it's really critical. I want to make sure we go through those properly. Okay. The first one is the responsible local official. Okay. Now, the responsible local official is the person who signs off on everything. They're the person who puts pen to paper to say, we are approving this project. Okay. And there are steps involved of when they have to sign things. They're essentially signing that they're going to spend the federal aid properly in that efficient, effective, and compliant manner. And they're the person who signs off on the project. So, who might be a good person to be the responsible local official? Okay. So in the Q&A, who would be a good person to put as the responsible local official? Could be the mayor, it could be the commissioner. Usually it's more likely to be the mayor. Going to have to usually be somebody who has financial capabilities. Okay. So it's probably somebody on more of the elected side of the house. Okay. It can be in some limited cases a commissioner or a county official, but more likely it's an elected official because they're the ones who have the fiduciary responsibility, the monetary responsibility. Okay. It can be uh, the person who is managing the project, but generally it's actually probably not bad to actually separate that out and not have the person who's actually watching the project be the responsible local official so they can ask good questions. Okay. It can be the same for a small agency, but just keep in mind what they're responsible to do. Okay. The next person is the project manager. Okay. We're going to come back quite a bit to the project manager. This is probably the single most important person. Okay. This is the person who is in charge of the entire project, and they should be full time. Now, I'll come back with a slide in just a second that talks about some language that's in there. It's a little different, but the project manager generally should be, and there has to be at least one full time person working for the local agency, the sponsor, and that person is technically the project manager. Okay? They have to be in responsible charge of the entire process. That means the process itself, which is why it's good to have the person signing the certifications to be somebody else to help act as a check and a balance. Generally, you want somebody separate, the local official who's responsible, different than the project manager. Now, in the case where you have a project manager, full-time staff person, maybe an engineer on staff who's acting as a project manager, that's where the highway superintendent or the commissioner can be the responsible local official. But you want to keep that separation if you can. It's actually a good thing. Okay. Now, there's another term called the engineer in charge. Sometimes the resident engineer is the term that's used. Engineer in charge is more common because you can get confusion with the resident engineer at the state DOT. That's the person who is essentially on site with the contractor. They're making sure everything gets done. That person could be an employee of the agency, or they could be a contractor, an engineering firm that you've hired. Okay. They don't have to be full time. They don't even have to be on the project full time. But they're the ones monitoring things in the site. They watch the work zone. They make sure that the plans are being followed. They make sure that everything is safe and things like that. The engineer in charge is a pretty important role. So keep that in mind who that is. They have to fill out a daily diary, and yes, there's a form for that. They're the ones who are actually making sure the quantities are done correctly, and the project manager watches this. Now, could you have one person do both? Well, technically, yes, but again, it's usually better to have those people separated out so the project manager can monitor the overall system and make sure that there's not going to be an issue involved. Okay? Who's signing off on what? And yes, this is reimbursable. If you hire a contractor to be the engineer in charge, yeah, you can get reimbursed for that. So if you're going to have a federal project coming up, you could either hire somebody or hire a consulting firm to be the engineer in charge. And then, of course, you're going to have inspectors. Those inspectors, how many you have, there actually are requirements for how many you need as a minimum. You can't have too many inspectors, but be careful. You can over inspect. And we'll talk a little bit about that issue and where that can actually create problems for you, what the role of the inspector is and what they're really trying to do. Okay. So these are the people within the sponsoring agency. And again, usually the inspectors are hired out unless you've got a fairly big staff and you can have them on staff. Okay. Now, the project manager, uh, yes, this picture is out of focus on purpose because long before you get to construction, you need to figure out who's going to be the project manager. For most counties and cities, that's probably the commissioner or the highway superintendent, but who's going to be that person? Generally, as I say, that person needs to be full time. Okay. There are some ways around that. Doesn't have to be technically the project manager, but I can tell you right now, you got to have somebody full time anyway, and generally it's the project manager. The actual text from Chapter 15 in the Local Projects Manual says the person in responsible charge must be a full time employee of the sponsor. Okay, so keep that in mind. Somebody monitoring the project has to be a full time employee. Okay, you need somebody else who's signing off on the certifications. That's a different person. And if it's the mayor or a town supervisor, they're not full time employees necessarily. So you can't really have those people act as the person in responsible charge. And these are the project manager role, the engineer in charge role. You need a full time employee. Are you ready for that? Are you able to monitor everything? And we're going to talk about those duties before you get that final decision being made. Okay. So, what are the duties of the project manager? Well, let's just go through a few of them. First off, keep in mind the project manager is not the EIC. Let's see, I got a note in here in the Q&A. Can a city engineer serve as that person? I'm assuming you're talking about the project manager. Yes, they could. The city engineer certainly can do that. In a lot of cities, that's actually what they do. But they then have underneath them an engineer in charge, the person on site monitoring the actual on site work. That project manager is not the EIC. Don't mix the two. It can be done, but boy, it can be difficult. They cannot be the project manager from a hired consulting firm. Remember, the project manager has to work for the local sponsor, okay? And they have to be a full-time employee. Could you hire somebody to just be the project manager during a project? Yeah, you could. For a big project, it might even be worth hiring somebody to just be the project manager, but they have to be a full-time employee, okay? The EIC, the person on site, whether they're full-time or not, that's a decision you have to make on how you want the project to work. But the project manager, think of that as a full-time person. Okay. Now, they have to ensure a whole bunch of stuff. Okay. And we're going to talk about all the things they have to do. Most of what we're going to be talking about are the duties of the project manager, the PM. They're going to ensure that the record keeping system is set up. They're going to ensure that all the approvals are done properly. They're going to ensure the paperwork runs up the chain of the command to the responsible local official so they sign off on it. They're going to make sure that they go down the chain of command through the EIC and to the contractor to make sure all the project plans are being followed and the specs are being followed. Okay. If you're going to be using a software system to monitor the project, like an Appia or something like that, both the PM, project manager, and the EIC need to be involved. Okay. They're going to be reviewing the daily work reports and engineers' diaries every single week. They really should be getting the habit. You need to set aside some time to look everything over. They got to review the schedule of work to make sure everything's been done, and they're going to be checking everything. They may not be out on the site every single day, but they should be checking it. And every couple of weeks, need to have a meeting with the people who are on site, the EIC, to make sure the schedule is being followed. Okay. And of course, they have to review everything. They have to review all the documentation because that's how you're getting paid. They have to review that materials are being taken care of. Are you following the procedures for DBE, disadvantaged businesses? Are you doing good faith efforts? All of this runs through the PM. Okay. So if you think about it, the PM's role is to make sure everything is being done right through ensuring projects are followed and reviewing everything that is submitted before it runs up and you get paid. Okay. So that's important because they sign off on everything. And once they've signed off, then it goes up to get paid through the responsible local official, the RLO. And so that's a pretty important role. Now, the PM does have to be out on the job site and attend anytime that there's a federal highway review or an RLPL visit. So, you do need to go out to the job site some, and it's actually a good recommendation. In fact, I would actually recommend that all of these things you need to do every week or two, go out in the field, check things out in the field. Don't just do the paperwork from the office. It's really hard to review projects from a distance. And the great thing about local agencies is you can do that in a fairly short period of time. So get in the habit of going out there. So what I want to do is I want to have you tell me, what questions do you have about the duties of the PM? Yes, we're going to cover them in a lot more detail, but right now, what are you thinking about? Okay. And I'll answer a few of them, and some of them I may save for the Q&A session on the third day. But what questions are you thinking in your mind about the PM's duties? What questions do you have? EBO entries. Ooh, that's a good one. EBO is a computer program to track and monitor equal opportunity and things like that. Change orders, yeah. Who they're responsible for change orders. We'll definitely talk about that. What are the knowledge of procedures? Yeah, you need to know ahead of time. Who has the authority to make decisions? That the PM definitely has to have that authority, or they're really not going to be effective. Yeah. How many projects can you manage at once? That's up to you. If you've got somebody you can assign to just doing that role of a PM, you might be able to do 4 or 5 small projects. But boy, how much time do you really have? Okay. So ask yourself if you're going to be the project manager. Does the RLR PM approve change orders? We'll talk a lot about who approves change orders. Generally, that's done by the project manager. The RLO just certifies them. Whoops. Sorry about that. Hit the wrong spot. Okay. Make sure you got money. By the way, that should be done early. Engineering judgment versus public input. Does the PM need to be licensed? So that's a good one. I'm going to scroll down so I can keep that one on screen. The answer is no. The project manager does not need to be a licensed engineer. Now, you may need a licensed engineer in the project, and generally the EIC on a project is a good idea to have that person, and we'll talk about that a little bit when we get to inspections. But no, they do not have to be licensed, but that is something to think about. Yep. How to moderate between the consultant and the contractor during conflicts. Yep. That's one of the primary roles of the PM is to act as that moderator. Okay. Okay, because the consultant is not the engineer in charge. That engineer in charge works for the local agency as the primary role is helping the local agency, though a lot of times it is the same person, and that can create conflicts. What changes can be made to plans after Psne transmittals memo is submitted? In other words, i.e. change orders. We'll talk a lot about change orders. Okay. Whoops, I keep hitting the wrong switch here. Got to go over here. Verification on certified payrolls, OSHA 10 hour. Yeah, all of these are things you've got to do. And how much responsibility can you put under the consultant PM? Well, you can hire somebody to do most of these activities through an engineering consulting. But at the end of the process, the PM is the one who signs off on it. So how much do you want to give away versus understanding yourself? And if you are giving a consultant to do that work, remember you're still full time. then you need to understand what documentation do you need to be confident that what you're getting from the consultant is enough, because you're still signing off that it follows the procedures for efficiency, effectiveness, and compliance. Okay. How long after the project does the PM have to be in the loop? Certainly through audit stage, and we'll talk about audits a little bit. Yep. They need to assist the resident engineer in resolving issues. Yep. Yeah, that's where they should get involved. They need to get involved when there's issues beyond their control. And should the PM be consultant or government based? Well, again, it goes back to this idea, and I'm going to go purposely backwards up here. I wanted to look at the list again. These are the 4 roles that the sponsor has to have. Responsible local official works for the sponsor, the local agency. Project manager, somebody working for the local agency. Engineer in charge could be working for the local agency or for a consulting firm. Inspectors could be working for the local agency or for the inspectors. But remember, these 2 roles right here work for the local agency. And the project manager, or the person filling that role, has to be a full-time employee of the agency. Okay? Here, I'll put that slide up just to remind you. Okay? So in the Q&A, it's a good question. Does it make more sense to have the highway superintendent or a town clerk in the PM role? Because of the technical nature of these projects, I would almost assuredly tell you, make it the highway superintendent. Okay? Because they're going to be reviewing it both from a financial standpoint, but also from a technical standpoint. That person really needs to be able to do both. And if you don't feel you can do both, then you need to think about, is federal aid really the project that you want to have? There's some requirements there. Okay. So we will give you opportunities to put more questions going on to things and go from there. But just to keep that in mind, there's all kinds of things. We'll definitely talk about them quite a bit. Now, some of the other roles and responsibilities that are involved, who's doing them for the sponsor? We can talk about that a little bit as we go along. But there's going to be a pre-construction meeting. Okay. Now, that pre-construction meeting is where you and the contractor and a whole bunch of other folks sit in the room and you figure out what's actually going to get done. Make sure you've covered all the bases and the details and you've thought the project out. And certain people have to be involved, and we'll come back to that. But that is run by the sponsor, the local agency. You've got to make sure they're qualified inspection staff. You've got to certify those people. Either you've got them on staff or you hire them, because that's your role and responsibility. Again, usually done by the project manager. You've got to ensure compliance. I keep coming back to that. Everybody's looking at compliance for all the rules and the regulations. The sooner you think about those issues, the easier they are to comply. Okay, and we'll definitely be going through that a lot next Tuesday. We're going to talk about change orders. The PM and the sponsor is responsible for change orders, and there's certain change orders which are allowed, and there's certain which are not. And there's certain ones where you can get more money, and there may be cases where you don't. So you need to understand them. We'll talk a lot about that. And then finally, of course, the closeout, the paperwork, all that fun stuff. So that's really what we're going to be spending a lot of time on to deal with things of that issue. Okay. Now, everybody has a role to play. There's a combined responsibility. We're trying to raise those rolls up and make the cinnamon rolls as high as possible, or our buns, or whatever we're cooking. So there is a combined responsibility for everybody from the Federal Higher Administration down to the local sponsor. Okay. One of the most critical ones is the idea of the change order. Okay. Now, you may have heard the term order on contracts. In fact, if you read the Local Projects Manual and a lot of the information from the state, you'll see the term order on contracts. I'm going to give you a hint. They're the same thing. Okay, there are nuances in the words, but generally they're the same thing. So when you hear the term change order in the paperwork, it may call it an order on contract. And we'll talk a lot more about order on contracts or change orders next Tuesday. But keep in mind a change order is the same thing. The goal of this process is to make sure the scope, long before you build, is set properly so that you don't get scope creep. Somebody had put that in the Q&A pod. And you don't wind up with a situation like this humorous picture you see on the internet, where somebody's got their little boat that says original contract and the big boat that says change order. Uh, that's what we're trying to avoid with change orders. Change orders have a purpose, and there's a joint responsibility. Everybody has a role to play in that particular case. Now, before I get to the next slide, see if anybody can remember what is a PODI. If I say PODI, what's a PODI or PODI in the Q&A? Let's see if somebody can pop in there what a PODI is. Very good. Projects or project of division interest, okay? And so if it's a project of division interest level 1, the sponsor does orders and contracts, change orders, prepares them. DOT reviews and transmits them to FHWA, and they approve them, okay? So think about this. Essentially, for high-level projects, the sponsor prepares everything, DOT reviews, and they actually send it up the chain to FHWA, who does final approvals. So they approve time extensions. They approve claim settlements when there's a conflict. They approve all the final acceptance. So if it's a level 1 project, FHWA is completely involved, and they have to have time and personnel and people involved, okay? Which is why when they get involved, they want to make sure it's worth their time and they're worth their while, but they're going to be involved the whole process all the way through, okay? Versus all the others, the type 2, 3, and 4 projects, where they're only going to be looking at the paperwork now and then. All the approvals come from NYSDOT, okay, through the RLPLs and then the various different groups within the New York State Department of Transportation. So the sponsors got the same role. They're preparing everything, all the paperwork, checking everything out. NYSDOT's approving it in these cases. And FHWA pretty much is just spot checking in category 3, okay? Now they may do subsequent approvals to look at audits, to look at different actions that are going on, and we'll talk about some of those audit procedures that are involved. But spot checks are mainly on the order on contracts, the change orders, to make sure things are being done properly. And they may get involved in an audit now and then to look at things, okay? Now, in this particular case, someone had asked earlier, does the person need to be a licensed engineer? For things that are engineering based, when there's an approval, remember, if it's an engineering change, it does have to be approved by an engineer. So the sponsor will need to have an engineer approve if it's an engineering level change, a structural change, a thickness of something. You will need an engineer involved in those cases. Okay. So what I want to do is I'm going to ask you some questions and get your Q&A pod ready to go. We're not doing this via the polls. So I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to sort of tell me what the answer is, and then we'll go through that answer a little bit here. So our first question, what is FHWA's involvement in projects and what guidance describes federal involvement? Okay. What is FHWA's involvement in projects and what guidelines describe that? They have oversight. Yep. Okay. What else? Design and construction meets federal reviews. What are those 3 words we're looking for? Technical assistance. Ooh, I like that. Somebody mentioned technical assistance. That's good. They're following via 23 CFR, which is highways. Ensuring compliance. Good. Effective, efficient, compliant. Very good. Inspection. Nope. Inspection's done by the sponsor. They're not involved. They're approving things, but the technical actual inspections in the field is done by the sponsor and the people they hire. Okay. They're mainly going to be doing a lot of reviews on level 1 projects and approvals on level 1 projects via their steward and oversight. They're doing audits. Yeah, good. Okay. Now, I'm going to mention something too. Now, we're going to be talking about this more, but it's something you need to be thinking about if you're a local sponsor to review. And this is actually a good document to look at, even though it's technically not part of the local projects manual, but it'll help you in this particular case. And that's something called the Project Development Manual, or PDM. New York State has developed this for their own projects. It can be very helpful for you to review it for any projects that you're doing. Because if you follow that PDM with some limitations where there's places you can't do certain things DOT is allowed to do because of internal issues, we'll talk about some of those. But if you follow the PDM, you're probably going to be in pretty good shape with both federal and state reviews because you're following a well-known procedure. And so it's something to definitely look at, and you probably want to go through it. That's where that figure comes from with the lovely, looks like the game of life. You can almost imagine the little car with the people in it. It's the game of projects. Okay. Okay, let's do another one. What would be reasons to contact the FHWA area engineer? Why do you think the state DOT, when do you think they would contact the FHWA area engineer? Not talking about standard, do it on a regular basis. What issues with compliance, help for technical assistance, coordinating with other entities, cost increases. Ooh, I like that one. That's a good one. Yep. Yep. Claim resolution, issues with change orders. Yeah, very good. Easy way to think about it. Changes and need for technical assistance. So the RLPL will contact FHWA when there's a concern that there's a change order, something going on, or there's something odd, you're not sure what the spec says, or ooh, there's something different here. So the state needs to communicate with FHWA just like sponsors need to communicate with New York State DOT. Okay, let's try one more here. Actually, I've got two more. What kind of problems are considered urgent enough to be brought to the FHWA area engineer's attention? What do you think would be something where they're going to pick up the phone and they're going to call and they're going to say, you need to get out here now, or you're going to have to deal with something now? A major change order. Okay. Ooh, eligibility for federal funds. Yeah, that's a really important one. They definitely want to be involved if there's an issue of whether this is going to be eligible for federal funds. And yes, they're probably going to be involved with safety and accidents because that's going to be a major change. It might be a compliance issue, a serious safety incident. So again, if you want to break it down, are there issues of compliance, either through safety or DBE issues or environmental issues or civil rights? Or are there issues where, look, if this work keeps going, they may not be able to get the funds. They may lose federal aid eligibility. That's when they pick up the phone and the RLPL calls FHWA or contacts them. Okay, easy way to remember it. Okay, let's look at the RLPL now. Okay, so RLPL is having a hard time getting responses from the sponsor's EIC, the guy in the field. What should the RLPL do? And by the way, conversely, let's say that you as the sponsor are having a problem getting hold of your EIC. Okay, contact the PM. Yep, that's why it's good to have the PM who is separate. Yep, call the project manager. They may need to show up on site. Generally, they should contact the PM before they do that, not just drive out there. They may have to contact the responsible local official, as someone put in here, but generally it's through the PM. That's where the PM is there. And then they would elevate it if there's no response. They would move it up. So the first persons would be the EIC. If they can't get the EIC, they go to the PM, and then they elevate it up from there. Okay, we'll talk a little more about disputed work in a little bit. All of this work comes back to something we're going to talk a lot more about called the CMP. Okay, so another set of initials, CMP, or Construction Management Plan. Okay, there is a piece of paperwork that has to be in place before you start digging in the ground called the Construction Management Plan, and it will outline the roles and responsibilities of everybody involved. So it will actually lay out who calls whom when something happens. Okay, so preferably we don't have to do that, but something to keep in mind. Okay. So, do FHWA laws supersede sponsored bid documents, the articles, and/or a local law? Do FHWA laws supersede sponsored bid documents, articles, and/or laws? And I'm seeing yeses. I'm seeing a whole bunch of yeses. But of course, I wouldn't ask a question that just had one simple answer to it because that's not the way. Ooh, I got a not always. Yep. Here's a way to think about it. Federal laws control unless the local law is stricter. Okay? So the federal law should always be followed as a minimum, but if the local or state law has a stricter requirement, and we're going to give you several examples of that over the next 2 days and 1 hour, you would then follow the local law. So if federal law says that the minimum size for a stop sign is 24 inches, or in this case, regulation, and you want to go bigger, you can go bigger. So if the federal law is less strict, you can have a local law that's stricter and you would follow that. But you have to follow as a minimum the federal law. That's an easy way to remember it. Follow as a minimum the federal law, and then you may need to go beyond if there's a local or state law. And we'll give you several examples of that as we go through the day. Okay? Now, one way to think about this is if you're building a project in New York State, outside of New York City, you have to follow the New York State standard specifications, which are different than some federal specifications in many cases. Okay? So keep that in mind. Make sure you follow the minimum. Okay? And somebody put in here the local law. Dave McEwen from DOT put in local law can't be anti-competitive. Yeah, and that's actually a good example where you can't write a local law that actually lessens the power of the federal law. The federal law requires competition. So you can't say the person has to be in county A or county B. That's not what they mean by stricter. You can't say to somebody, you have to be from this county. That would actually break federal law. The local law that would be the equivalent is you can say you have to go further afield than the minimum requirements for federal law. You can't make it go in the other direction. So if you're not sure about that, what do you think you need to do? Pick up the phone and talk to the RLPL. Okay? Don't assume. Okay, here's our question. Can the sponsor change how an item is paid for from everyone to local dollars only? Now, let me explain this. This is a question that was in a class that I went to, and I liked the question. And I thought long and hard about how do I write this, and I didn't like the wording. So I'm going to explain it to you. You're building a bridge, and there's federal dollars because federal aid, and there's state dollars, maybe Bridge New York funds, and there's sponsor funds, 5%. Okay? And you want to change it to pay the entire cost of a particular item out of local money, 100% local dollars. Can you do that? Can you change it? And I bet I'm gonna get several different answers here. Only with a change form, a tip change form. Yep, there's paperwork involved. Absolutely. Got to do a change order. I've got to know if it's within the federal project scope. You still have to meet federal regulations. You might be able to in some cases. Here's a very important way to think about it. Okay? It does, the old joke about the pins comes into play, but don't start with that. Start with one word. The word I would always look at is, and we'll see if my pen works today. Yep, it's working today. Yay. Why? Always ask the question, why? We're going to come back to why quite often. Why are you doing this? Okay? If the reason you're doing it is because you've got a limited amount of federal dollars and you want to make sure you've got them available for some other part of the project, that's probably okay. But if you're doing it because you're like, well, if I swing it to local, I don't have to meet some federal state rule. Uh-uh. You can't do that. Okay. You have to have a good why. You can do it. Yeah, somebody put it in the Q&A. If it's a betterment for public benefit, you might be able to do that. Okay. You might be a case, for instance, that maybe the Federal Highway Administration doesn't allow you to use federal dollars to pay for something. As long as it doesn't break federal law or rules, you might have to pay for it with local funds. But it has to be that why behind it. If you're not sure, what do you do? Before you make the change, what do you do? In the Q&A, what do you do there? Communicate. Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. Ask the RLPL. Okay. Yep. Now, I stole some time from you, and I apologize. I've got my notes in here that tell me what time I'm supposed to take the break at 10:45, and it's actually almost 10:53. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to take our break, and we're not going to start back up at 11. Okay. We're going to give you your 15 minutes, and I apologize for that. So we're actually going to start back up at 11:07. Okay. So I'll cross that out, and we're going to start up at 11:07 a.m. Okay. And I'll change the time on the clock. So we'll start back up. Enjoy your break, and we'll see you at 11:07. We'll be starting up again in about 4 minutes, just for those who are wondering. Last chance to check your email and refill that coffee. About 2 more minutes, we'll be starting back up. Gotta unmute yourself. Never works too well to talk to a blank phone. But the computer knows that, which is pretty cool. So we're going to get started back up. We are going to be done at noon today. We built in some flex time and we can move things around a little bit. So the goal is to be done at noon so everybody can get lunch and then get outside on a glorious day, get some work done or travel if you have to. So really the focus of almost the entire rest of this workshop today and the next 2 Tuesdays is Chapter 15 of the Local Projects Manual, Administer Construction Contracts. Um, in your handout, you've got a link to that. We're going to be going through that quite a bit. We're going to be talking about introduction, project management, and pre-construction today, and then we'll get into the rest of the manual over the next couple of days. Okay. Now, in terms of federal aid construction contracts, uh, there are all kinds of things involved and provisions involved in federal aid construction contracts. And we're going to go through a lot of detail on all of these things next Tuesday. But just as a bit of a flavor, just to see how y'all think about this, what federal aid provisions do you think are included directly or indirectly in Chapter 15 or in federal aid when you're getting federal aid, whether it's Bridge New York funds or the old Safe Routes to School or it's part of the TIP? What federal aid provisions do you think you have to worry about? So again, put them in there. Wage rates, yep. Some Davis-Bacon kind of things. DBE or disadvantaged businesses, yep. Buy America, okay. And I'll read some of them in the Q&A for those who don't have access to the poll EV. We've got ADA, yep. Okay. There's the general rules and regulations that we fall under, CFR 23, which is the highway portion. Your certification of your payroll and prevailing wages, yep. Okay. Training requirements. There are some training requirements for accidents and safety that come into play, OSHA 10, things like that. You may need to worry about the contract reporter for advertisements. There are some advertising rules. Some of those are state regulations, some are federal. Okay. You got to be careful about local hiring. You got to be very careful on restrictions for that. You may not always be able to do that, but there are some ways you can put that into some agreements. Yeah. CUF. I'm not going to tell you what CUF stands for today, but it's something to think about. It's related to DBE, which is another acronym. Okay, let's see what else we got here. Whoops. Go back, Dave. There we go. Minimum dollar value to be qualified. Appia or some other software compliance. That's more of guidance within the state rules. You have to have something under local projects electronic, but what it is, there's actually some ways to do something else. Okay. Compliance with seeker. Okay. Now I have a list here that I wrote down. Let's see, did we get them all? There's a couple I don't see on here. I was a little surprised I didn't see based on who I see on the class, but just a couple more to think about, and we'll come back to a lot of these, but civil rights issues, discrimination, segregated facilities. So you may not think we still have those issues, but we still do. So those are things to think about. Good faith efforts, contract work requirements, subletting. How much can the prime do versus not the prime? Fraud, false statements, and of course any particular administrative issues that have come up in place. Okay, so yeah, there's lots of federal aid provisions that exist, and I'm not going to say we're even going to come close to covering all of those, but I just want you to be aware they're there. And the good news is almost all of the things you really have to worry about will be covered by some of the requirements either in the local projects manual or other parts of it, not just chapter 15. So you don't have to go out and hunt for them. They're available for you. And of course, you can always pick up the phone and talk to the RLPL and set up a meeting. Okay. So let's talking about project management, local projects. If you read that project manual for the state, the project development manual, the PDM, you'll see something that talks about local contracts have to have record keeping requirements, and that the state uses something called site manager. Site manager is not available to local projects. So if you see that in the text, realize that you have to come up with an alternative, Appia or Field Manager, one of those other kind of projects. And as I say, there actually is technically a way you could do your own stuff, but truth be told, I would advise using an electronic form that others have already used. And this allows you to fill out the forms. And there's actually one case where there's actually a program you have available you actually have to use for a lot of your paperwork. But the goal here is to follow something called, let me get my mouse to move this forward. The MURK, or MERK, the Manual of Uniform Record Keeping. Okay, and again, we gave you a link to that um, that goes on there. I don't know if Procore, this is in the Q&A, meets the requirements. I have to admit, I just don't know. Maybe one of our friends from either DOT or FHW, who I know are on the call, but we'll have the question. We can always answer that or get that asked on the Tuesdays from now with the Q&A. But the Manual of Uniform Record Keeping is the paperwork process the state uses for construction projects. And within that, there are two parts, part one and part two. And the contract administration manual is part of the Manual of Uniform Record Keeping and needs to be followed. So in addition to the Local Projects Manual, you definitely want to know and learn the Manual of Uniform Record Keeping, the MERC. Okay? It's just something to get in the back of your brain, read it, start looking through it, figuring out what forms are available. And again, you can't use Site Manager, but there are other electronic forms that are available you may want to think about a little bit. Okay? So you'll see Site Manager, but realize you have to have some other kind of plan. And we'll talk more about construction administration as we go down through all of this, but it's just something to keep in the back of your mind as you're looking at things. Now, you're going to develop, now this is before construction. This is actually all the way back into design in some respects and can even go back into scoping, a project management plan. Now, I did my undergraduate days here at Cornell as well, and sadly this truck is no longer there, but anybody who's a Cornell graduate, when they hear the initials PMP, they don't think of project management plan. We think of poor man's pizzas, where you put a pizza on a piece of Italian hoagie roll, and they were good. They weren't healthy, but they were good. But a PMP in this particular case is a project management plan. Okay. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, "Oh man, what have I got to do there?" Well, the good news is you don't have to do that much of anything. And I'm going to go back to here and see if my computer, it did work perfectly. A project management, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can actually use a sample, and there's one available to you. We have a link to it, and it's available inside the Local Projects Manual, where you can go through and just use that as a template. Now, I will say this several times through the course of the next 2 days and the last hour here. I don't like paperwork. Some people who know me know that. I'm not a fan of paperwork. I love forms. Good forms help us not miss something because we then know, oh, I got to do A, I got to do B. So let's go through this sample project management plan. Okay, I'm not going to fill it out directly, but I may have you put some things in the Q&A pod or raise your hands, just talking a little bit about some of the things on the PMP. Okay, so if you do a federal project, one of the things that will happen fairly early on is you will get a PIN number. That PIN number is something you're going to be just using again and again and again. And that's how you actually bill. You bill against that PIN number. And you may actually get multiple PINs in some cases, but the PIN number, okay? You're going to have a contract number. That's actually usually part of the proposal. And in this particular case, because it's a federal aid project, it's going to start with the letter D. Our contracts with DOT start with the letter C. They give you that. So that's pretty easy. The project title, okay, we should all know that. The location, you'll notice it could be multiple cities, towns, and counties. It could even be a village. You'll just fill that out. And the sponsor, i.e. the local agency. That's it. Good. And then the general description of scope of work. Now, I know there's probably some people thinking, I don't have enough room to write the scope of work for a complicated project here. It's actually a good exercise to make yourself fit it into the space. You've got probably 20, 25 words here to put that in. Can you describe your project in 20 to 25 words? And don't write it for other engineers. Write it for the public. That's who we serve. Write it in such a way that they would understand what you're trying to do. Okay? Don't try to use flowery language that's challenging and difficult. So, yeah, say reconstruction of Jones Road, as someone put in there. Keep it simple. If I ask you to go out and find me a four-legged creature that can act as a companion when I'm feeling lonely, what am I asking for? Put it in the Q&A pod. A dog? Yeah, could be a dog. What else could it be? Could be a cat. It could be a lizard. I did say four legs, so it's not a fish. But the point is that if you want a dog, ask for a dog. If you want a cat, ask for a cat. In your general description, keep it simple. Okay? You can drive yourself nuts with really long, fancy words. And again, it should be aimed at the public. Okay? You're then going to look at your project schedule. They help you. They figure out, okay, where does it fit in the STIP? Did you meet NEPA approval? That's essentially almost all the way back to scoping. Did you meet PS&E approval? What's the date? Did you move final acceptance? Now you're thinking, why is final acceptance on the project management plan? Because this is going to become a permanent record. Okay? You can actually put in there what you think the date will be. You should actually schedule these things out. So the actual date will get put in here eventually, but you'll create a plan that has the proposed date when you think it's going to be, and you can schedule this all out. And so this is where you develop your planning phases, your scope development. Okay. Do you need to have a state local agreement? Well, of course. So when is that going to be done? When's it going to get approval? Have you got a schedule and cost? If there's federal funds, you need to have a preliminary estimate, an engineering estimate. Okay. Did you hire a consultant in the scoping phase? Okay. And do you need one? Are you going to do it internally? So again, you can walk through all of these steps and go on here. Okay. A classic one that people sometimes go past too quickly, right of ways. Do you have the right of way that you need? And when you sign off on this, it means you don't have any right of way issues. And yet, how many times does that come up into the issue? Did you have a public information meeting? Do you need one? Usually yes. When did you have it? And when were the dates? And again, a lot of these you've got a small space, and sometimes you're going to have to add in multiple lines. My advice to anybody who can get this form, a lot of times they're available in Word on the web, or convert it to a Word document or whatever format you like and fill it out. Okay? This is where you're going to get your program agreements, your utility agreements, your railroad agreements. I mean, how long does it take to get a railroad change? Anybody ever worked with a railroad? How long does it take to get the railroad to make a change? Anybody have an idea? Well, forever is not probably true, but years, it can take years. So you probably actually need to be thinking about those people all the way back in the planning phase. Okay. And which agencies do you have to deal with? So what's the scope? And as you develop that, you may have to go back and look at additional parts of the projects. A month of Sundays. Now, if you spelled that with an E, I'd be happy, but with a Y, it's a little more challenging. Okay. So then you have your PS&E. We're happy. We're good. We've got everything else. Notice it says here, preliminary engineering federal aid closed. Any unused funds returned. You can get paid for preliminary engineering, your PS&E. It's a federal eligible project if you've included it in the overall scope. Don't shortchange yourself. Ask for what you need. Remember, we're talking really, in the case of federal dollars, we're not talking much. I have a old college uh, fraternity brother who works for OMB. He doesn't worry about it until he starts seeing 9 digits in the number. Everything else is loose change. So don't shortchange yourself. Get the funds you need. Ask for what you need. You might be surprised. Yes, money is tight, but money is usually not the problem. It's communication. Okay? Do you need to change a step? Do you have your construction management plan? When's the bid opening? And again, I would put all of these down to preliminary, and then when it's actually done, you fill out the actual date. Much in the same way, I wrote the actual time of the break that I let you out late. Track everything. Okay? And again, the whole process, that's what these forms are really good at. Okay? It even helps you with things such as funds management and project cost control. You know, did you get the funds authorized? Do you have the right of way? Where you are in the phase of work? Do you have soft match or in-kind services? And are they available in this particular project? So what do I mean by soft match or in-kind services? And why would I need those? Anybody want to answer that one for me? Why would I want and what would be eligible for soft match? Ooh, I've challenged you. Uh-oh. Staff time? Plowing on a federal aid? Well, it's your time. Yeah, your time, the local's time. Okay. But it'd be on the federal project itself. Why would that be something you'd want to think about? It's things that the highway department can do. Yeah. If you're doing a Marcicelli project, don't ask me to spell Marcicelli. I barely can pronounce it right. And let's say it's a $1 million project. I know that's a big project, but I told you, don't shortchange yourself. We're going to ask for a lot of money. Yeah, someone's got it in here, but I've got Marcicelli funds on a federal aid national highway system roadway. What portion of that project, the bridge project, is federal dollars? What portion is state? And what portion is local or sponsor dollars? 5%, 75, 15, and 5. Uh-oh. 80, 15, and 5. Very good. Yeah, you need to get those. Better be 100% when we're all said and done. Okay? The point is, there are very few things that are 100% federal dollars or 100% state dollars. There's almost always some local dollars involved. Not every project is eligible, so don't assume this, but most projects allow a soft match or in-kind services. But you have to document those things. It could be your own time. Maybe the inspectors are from your own group, your own engineering. You do some of the preliminary clearing and grubbing. You can use that as your match in a lot of cases. But again, before you start the project, okay, you need to make sure that you understand whether it's even eligible for that. So make sure you've read the contract requirements before you go out and get the federal dollars. Okay. So then finally, you're going to create a budget. Okay. Don't shortchange yourself. Get your money in here. Get everything approved. How much you're going to be spending on the engineering, on the right of way, on construction, your own local dollars. You get a total price. And then you're going to start with a baseline. And I actually like this part of the form. I think this is a good way to do it. I do that with our projects too. I have a preliminary budget estimate, and then I actually create a separate page where I get a current, and I just track the difference between the two and see how I did. And I really want to be close. Now, someone asked, where do I find this form? This is linked as one of the appendices items in Chapter 15, if I remember correctly. But the easiest way to find the sample project management plan is go on Google and search New York State DOT or NYSDOT sample project management plan, and it'll pop right up. Okay, but it's an appendix, I'm 99% sure, in Chapter 15. So when you go and the link there that takes you to Chapter 15, it's Chapter 2, according to Doreen with local projects. So it's under Chapter 2, but it's under the Local Projects Manual. Okay. It may look slightly different. I modified it and made it into a PDF form so I could scroll down. So it may look slightly different. The point is find a form that helps you out. Okay. It lists who's responsible. You fill these things out. Who's going to be the responsible local official and their title. Who's the project manager, their title. Are you going to have a design consultant, internal or external? Still write them down. Okay. Everybody that's a major player should be included. These are all the people that are going to have to be involved with the meetings. Okay. And of course, what's not on this sheet? Because this hasn't been updated in a while, I've noticed. And Doreen, get ready to, you want to add this, I think, for the next version. What's the one thing not listed on here at the top where it says name, title, location, and phone numbers? Date? Yeah, date's a good one. Date should be on every page. I like date on every page. Some people care about pronouns. We probably should be thinking about that. Ah, there we go. Email. That's how we communicate these days. So make sure you have an email list. In fact, I usually create an email string. So you just literally paste it. You can even make a group within a lot of email packages. So if the project name is uh, reconstruction of Jones Road, I might call this Jones Road email group, or just something I can type up and email everybody in one fell swoop. Save myself time. Okay. It reminds you of certain things good forms do, to looking at risk. Risk is a huge issue with all of our federal aid, actually all of our projects. So remind you of certain things such as utilities, regulatory permits, railroad coordination. Just reviewing the sample plans can remind you of certain things to keep yourself out of trouble. Okay. So if you have to buy right of way, put it in the schedule, for instance. And they help you out, and you can read through these plans. And at the end of it, before you start the project, everybody's going to sign and date it. And if you opt to update it, go for it. Update it, sign it, and date it. Okay. So again, I'm a big fan of forms. They can help you out. They're not the only way to do it, but why reinvent the wheel in a process that we know if you follow it will be approved with less hassle. Okay. So this construction administration thing, I'm going to clear the responses. The Construction Administration Manual, which is part 1B of the MERC, the Manual of Uniform Record Keeping. What do you think the answer to this question is? The CAM must be used on all federal aid projects. Is that true on the National Highway System? Is it true on state highways? Is it true on local highways that are not part of the National Highway System? Or is it completely false? And guess what? You can put in more than one answer. You're supposed to be able to, at least. I never know for sure whether it will let me or not. I got an A, I got a B, I got people putting in all kinds of different answers. And again, you're supposed to be able to put more than one, but until it actually happens, I've never trust it completely. See? The CAM must be used on all federal aid projects. You've got to use, if you're getting federal aid, you got to follow the MERC. Okay? So if you're going to have to follow it anyway, you might as well get it, download it, and copy it, and get a copy of it. Okay? The Construction Administration Manual, which is part of the MERC, does have to be followed with the federal aid process. Okay? So keep that in mind as you're going forward. You've got to use it. Okay? It shouldn't be too bad. It's actually, the MERC's actually a pretty relatively easy. It's not thin, but it's actually pretty easy to follow. And it's a good way to look at things if you're not sure. And again, it'll help you out answering questions, things like that. As you develop your construction manual, and you can go from there. And so what this should hopefully help you do, this should hope you figure out who's going to be your project manager. Is it going to be you? Is it going to be somebody else? And it should slowly bring into focus, who is your project manager going to be? Okay. If it's you, do you have the time? If it's somebody else on your staff, how much time do they have? Can they dedicate the time to do the job correctly? Okay. Now, what I want to do is talk about construction supervision and that construction management plan a little bit more detail. Okay. We'll start with the CMP. The construction management plan, essentially that form in a lot of ways, you fill that out. Good question before I get started. What is the relationship between the PLAFAP and the CAM? Now, first off, we've changed the name, the PLAFAP, and I always have to look up what it stands for. is the old name for the Local Projects Manual. That's what it's called now. Even though on the web, it's still, if you look at the link, it still has the old abbreviation. I'm trying to shorten it, make it easier to understand. Again, plain, simple language. The construction management plan and the CAM, they're actually, some of them fall under this Manual of Uniform Record Keeping. They're related to each other. They're linked to each other. But the Local Projects Manual is essentially how to use all of the other things on local projects. What do local sponsors have to do to meet the federal and state requirements? So the relationship is one may require the other. And you can find all of that by reading through the Local Projects Manual, various chapters. Okay. So when you're developing your local plan for your construction portion, we're ready to go. We got our PS&E, we got a contract, we're about to get ready to build. You're going to need to meet with the RLPL. Set up a meeting. Okay. Now these days, obviously, a lot of them are done internet-based because of COVID, but just set up a meeting. You're going to look at your project milestones. That form will help you make sure you've got those milestones in place. Okay. You're going to develop your QA/QC plan. We're going to talk a lot more about the QA/QC plan. Okay. You're going to need to know a copy of the MERC. Okay. And it's, by the way, it's chapter part 1A, which is a contract administration manual. Part 2 is a materials inspection manual. Okay. But there's a whole bunch of things you need to be aware of and look at to develop your construction management plan. It's not as bad as you think. Just go back to the idea we had of the dinner arrangement. You're doing the same thing. You're just outlining all of the steps. Okay? So the first thing you do is you meet with who's ever making dinner and you figure out what you're having. In this case, maybe it's who's paying for dinner or who's overseeing to make sure dinner tastes good. You develop what the milestones are. When are you going to have to get the chicken in the oven? When do you put the broccoli on the steamer? How do you make sure it's cooked enough? That's your QA/QC. And then, do you need to do paperwork? For food, probably not, but you may want to track it. If you're a restaurant, you certainly are. And that's where the MERC comes into play, the paperwork process. And there's a whole bunch of stuff, and we'll come back to that next Tuesday. Now, I do want to spend a little bit of time on quality assurance and quality control, and I want you to help you understand the difference between the two. Now, QA/QC does not stand for quit asking, quit checking. I've heard people say that. QA/QC, quit asking, quit checking. QA/QC or QC/QA if you prefer. It's just an order. Everybody can have different orders. And there are lots of books. There's all kinds of information on this. But a way to think about this that actually is a pretty good one. The Federal Highway was talking this in a class that I was at. And I like the way they did this. You can think of quality control, a C, as the quality of the contractor. He's checking for quality control, or she's checking for quality control, or they are checking for quality control. QC, quality contractor. Versus the local sponsor, okay, that's the quality by the agency, quality assurance, okay. Now, some people like to say QC, QA, where quality control is measurable things, quality assurance is process things. That's not completely wrong, but there's a huge amount of overlap, and there's certainly a lot of sampling and testing in quality assurance, and there's certainly a lot of sampling and testing in quality control. But in one case, QC, the contractor is looking at production processes, field placement, installation procedures, and they're measuring things to make sure everything's done. In the case of our dinner, a QC example would be where the cook sticks a thermometer in to make sure that the meat is up to temperature. Okay. QA would be where the person inspecting the facility checks to make sure that the thermometer is actually working properly and randomly checks some of the things that have been cooked to make sure they were brought up to temperature. Okay. Very similar, but who's doing them and the processes involved will change some. Okay. And so the responsibility for quality assurance is the sponsor. So keep that in mind. You're going to be doing QA And there's a whole bunch of information on that in Chapter 12 and Chapter 2 of the Local Projects Manual and the Contract Management Plans that are available. So you need to develop good QA/QC plans. Your part of it as a local sponsor is the quality assurance. So keep that in mind. It's part of your construction management plan. That's where your inspectors get involved. So your inspection is there, some sampling and testing, not what the contractor's doing, but your sampling and testing. This should be independent of theirs, though there are ways to link the two that can be very helpful. And then finally, certifications and documentation. You may be getting that from a supplier or a contractor, but you have to get those things and certify them. Because if you don't have them, how do you know later on you got what you paid for? Okay, so examples might be the on-site inspection. Are you buying from an approved list of vendors, which the state keeps? Do you have to do lab testing? And how are the lab people certified? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, essentially, this is where you put together all your paperwork. So what I want to do as an example is just to think about what you'd want to have in a quality assurance program. And we did asphalt last time, so this time, no, we did concrete last time. We'll do asphalt this time. Okay, well, we'll do asphalt. That's what the slide says. So in the QA, give me some quality assurance items, things you check for in asphalt paving. And we got minutes, we might actually do the concrete one while we're at it. Compaction, density, temperature. Okay. Source. And this is where those forms, this is where having a list can really be helpful because you don't miss something. Okay. I've got a list of 4 or 5 things here I'm hoping to see, and let's just see if we catch them all. Density, laying. I see over on the side air temperature. Yeah, air temperature can actually be important. The ground temperature should be too. But again, is that a QA? It's just a weather issue. But yeah, it can actually make a difference. You should write these things down so that later on you know what might have happened. Supplier certs or tickets from the plant. Yeah. Are prevailing wages followed? That's a QA issue. Um, Almost separate, but it is something to think about. Okay. Let's see here. I'm still seeing 2 things I don't see on the list that I expected to see. Let me just look here as they come in, make sure I'm not missing it. I see slopes, that's good. If you have a safety edge, you'd have a different thing for the safety edge that's in there. I don't see smoothness on here. Is smoothness an issue? Is it something you want to check for? Is it part of your spec? Because here's the other thing about QA. If you do your QA early, think about everything you want to have for quality assurance. If it's important enough, put it as part of your contract specifications. Okay? And the other one I don't see on here, and this is actually a QA issue. Do they have enough trucks to keep the job moving and therefore set the paver speed based on the number of trucks? That could be something you ask the contractors to supply. They can supply you things that are QA, and then you would confirm that yes, indeed, they have enough trucks to do what they said they were going to do. Okay? So let's try this. Let's see if this works here. We'll do one. And for some reason, my computer has decided it does not want to show the slide for the concrete. So we're going to try something here. We're going to get my pen to work. And we're going to try this. Nope, it's not working today. So that's what we're just going to have to do with the old-fashioned way. I'm going to clear the results. And I want you to ignore the asphalt paving and ask yourself, what would it be if this were concrete, not asphalt? So assume it's concrete. I apologize, the computer will not let me change it. What would we be doing for concrete? I can at least write on the bottom down here, concrete. Okay. Slump, air, finishing, how much water was added, profile, mix design, did they meet the mix design? Long term is going to be compressive testing. How many days of testing do you have? Okay, cool. Yep. And again, all the kind of things you need to think about, and you could make yourself a long laundry list. I just want you to think about this process. What can you check? What should you check? And how much time do you have? And do you need to bring people in to do that? Okay. See if it pops forward for me. There we go. So the QA QC plan, you do want a plan that includes the contractor's portion of the work. It is required if it's on a national highway system or state highway, you have to have a QA plan approved, and they have to follow the NYSDOT specs and NYSDOT inspections. Okay. The nice thing is NYSDOT does the inspection, so we don't have to worry about paying for it. They're going to be doing most of that. There will be materials offsite quality assurance. That's your responsibility as the sponsor. So, if you've got somebody making parts for you, you've got to find a way to get certifications to certify that the precast concrete met spec or the bolts met spec. So you've got to come up with a process as part of your QA QC plan. And yes, the contractor can do some of that, but you need to have an independent way to verify it through quality assurance. Any steel items, for instance, you'll need a piece of paperwork. Okay. I don't have any sympathy if you don't get your federal dollars because you don't have a certification that the steel meets the spec. How do you know what you've purchased? Okay. And the same is true for structural concrete. Anything that is essentially part of the engineering, you need to have a quality assurance method in place to make sure you know what you've got, including bridge bearings. Okay. Off system, you still need to meet New York State DOT specifications. Do you get NYSDOT inspection? What do you think? In the QA, what do you think you get? Do you get NYSDOT inspection if you're off system? I've got a yes, I've got a yes, I've got a no. I've got a little bit of both. That's a good way to say it, not unless arranged. If you read the chapter 15, what it actually says is you can get NYSDOT inspection if it's already part of their inspection protocols and there's not additional cost to NYSDOT. So for instance, if you're buying concrete or asphalt from an approved plant, there's already an inspector there. They're going to certify your stuff as part of that processes. But if you're asking for them to go somewhere, they're not there on a regular basis, or they're not inspecting that particular day, you're going to have to do it yourself. And so this is where you really want to meet with and work with the RLPLs to figure out what parts NYSDOT can do for you and what parts you have to do yourself. And the good news is it's eligible for federal reimbursement. You don't have to pay for it out of the kindness of your own funds. You can get reimbursement for it or use it as a match if you're using your own funds. But the key is you need to figure out what parts NYSDOT's going to do and not do. And that's especially important when you're at a place where you think NYSDOT is there. Don't assume NYSDOT is doing the inspection. Make sure you talk ahead of time. Now, you're developing your construction management plan, and that's a pretty important document. This is essentially the plan of what we're going to actually do. So there's a whole bunch of documents that you need to have available for you. So what I would like you to do is think about what are the critical documents that you need to have sitting in your office or available on your computer as you're developing your construction management plan. Okay? What documents do you need to have? Okay? You need to have a scope. You need to have a schedule. Somebody put in the design report. Yep. The Manual of Uniform Record Keeping, the MERC, a work zone traffic control plan. And by the way, you'll notice when you put these in, you can upvote them. And you can say these are more critical than others. So even if you didn't put one in, you can vote. I think you have to put in at least one item before you can. And you can start saying what's the most critical items. And this should allow us to see what we think are the most critical items for the CMP. Drawings, specifications, the budget, okay? New York State DOT standard specifications, yeah. People really think the schedule is important, and yeah, I can't argue with that. The contract probably should be in there. That someone put that into the Q&A, and I don't see contract sitting on here as a high item. The project QA roles, that's part of the CMP, yep. We'll scroll down a little bit, see here else, what else is on the list. Contract is in there, yep. Permits, specifications, traffic control plan, scope, change order, special contract requirements, yep. Whole bunch of stuff is in there, okay? Whoop, went too far. Okay, Dave, where did you hide yourself? There we go. Now, what I would ask you to do is, as part of the handout, we're going to switch over here to the handout. In the handout, you'll see links. One of the links is to the Local Projects Manual and the different parts of it. And yes, it still has PLA FAP. But I'm purposely going to open up the portal for Chapter 15, the Administer Construction Contracts. Okay? And it's going to take it a second to come up because it takes just a little bit of time. And I'm going to scroll it over here to the screen. Okay? Get Chapter 15. Download it. Okay? Yeah, I've already downloaded it, but I'm just going to purposely, I want to do via the internet. We'll open this up. There's Chapter 15. Go through it and look. Okay? And you can look at it on the web, you can download it, and it will help you out. And so, for instance, in the beginning, when it talks about critical manuals, you need to reference, you need to have available to you certain New York State DOT standard documents, either guidance or policy documents, they could be either or both, available so that people are following these standards as part of your acceptance program, your QA program. So in this particular case, I'm going to make that even bigger. And I'll scroll up, and there you go. So we talked about standard specs. If you're doing steel, you need steel construction. If you're doing concrete, you need pre-stressed concrete if it's pre-stressed. You've got to have the various parts of the MERC available to you. You need to know the Materials Bureau's methods and the Geotechnical Engineering Bureau's and manuals and procedures. All of these might be included depending on the project. So make a list of which ones you have to be able to have to do your particular project. How do you find them? And you're like, man, how am I going to find the New York State Engineering Bureau manuals and procedures? Well, the great news is we have this friend, and again, I don't care if you use Bing or Ask or Google. I just happen to have Google as my current thing. And of course, it's getting close to noon. It knows it, so it's going to be slow. But sure enough, there it is. I just searched for it, and it will pop right up. And you'll get all the possible things. And you don't need them all. You can go through and figure out which ones are critical for your particular project. Okay? So keep that in mind as we go forward. What do you need to have and what do you need to reference? You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You just have to reference some other standard and you can use that instead. Now, this all leads to a pre-construction conference, okay, that you're going to have. And once my computer decides it wants to wake up, it'll pop up to what the somebody put in the Q&A pod where my computer decides to say hello. DOT approved suppliers listing. Yeah, that would be part of it too. If you have DOT approved items, you certainly would want to have that as one of the items in your QA plan. Okay, so you're going to have a pre-construction conference. Who has to be, who should be at that pre-construction conference? When I click the button and move forward, whose names am I going to see on this list? I've given you a hint, by the way, because I've sort of put in fun pictures and the logo for one of the people that has to be there. Who has to be at a pre-construction conference? The RLPL, a project manager representing the sponsor. Yeah, that's good. The contractor. Yeah, pretty important to have the contractor there. Okay. See who else. Did anybody get the one that's the deer? The inspectors. Yep. Yeah. I just chose a deer. These are pictures I've taken on morning walks in the last year, just of different critters as I've come across them. So let's see who I've got on my list. I've got the sponsor, usually represented by the project manager, and usually, by the way, the EIC should be there too. Uh, the contractor, pretty important. The inspection firm, you may be hiring a firm. It may be a consulting firm. It may be someone like Atlantic Testing or Payrolls for the old Empire Soils, whose name I can't remember anymore. There's lots of firms out there, but whoever's doing your inspection, if you're hiring people out, if it's your own people, you need to have them there. New York State represented by the RLPL. That's the minimum. They all need to be at the meeting. Okay, that's pretty important. Okay, this is where you hash things out and where if there's an issue, now is actually the best time. If you think there has to be a change order, you want to get those people involved in. Now, I noticed a whole bunch of other items were put in there. People said maybe an elected official, maybe utility people. It depends on whether their involvement in the project. I would have the elected people way before the pre-construction. I would not have them at the pre-construction. I'm talking those folks should be actually at pre-construction meetings, actually all the way back in scoping. Once you get past PSNE, information is one thing, but in these meetings you want to be able to hash things out and communicate. Okay, your scope is already set. Okay, and so yeah, the EIC doesn't required to be there, but I recommend the EIC be there. So the sponsor really is the PM and the EIC, the project manager and the EIC. Okay. Now, what is the job of the inspector? We're going to do a lot more in inspection next Tuesday, but just remember the job of the inspector is to look for conditions that are out of sorts. What are the criterion that were or were not followed? The cause and the effect of those issues. How does it change the schedule, the cost, contracts? Okay. One of the things about the job of the inspector that we don't do enough, and I've seen this happen and it's something we need to do, don't just have the inspector look for things that didn't meet spec. Document when you did meet spec. Absolutely vital. Write down when you actually met spec. Okay? That's just as important as when you didn't. Now, you're probably thinking, well, what about types of inspections from FHWA? We keep mentioning those people. Well, yeah, FHWA has its own inspections. We'll talk about them a little bit too when we get to the audit process. They have their own system, and we'll go into this in more detail later on. But just keep in mind, the job of the FHWA is efficiency, effectiveness, and compliance. They're not focused on how you're actually doing the work. So your inspectors are different than what FHWA or even the RLPLs would be looking at. Now, how do we do all this? There's tons of forms. I would advise you, these are attached to, samples of these are attached to your handout. Go through them. Take your time. Look at them all. We'll go through them a little bit more detail next couple of days, but just realize those forms are there to help you, okay, as much as anything else. They really are, okay? Yes, sometimes it seems like it's more important to fill out the form, and I will be honest and admit that, yeah, I sometimes agree with you, but they were developed for a reason, and if you have concerns or want changes, hey, we got folks from local projects good, legitimate issues, might be a good time to talk about. I know this chapter is one they're looking at, but they're there for a reason and they can help you. Okay. Now we're almost to noon. I just got one couple of last little things I want to talk about. We're just about done with day one. We are going to be doing more on contract administration and documentation next week. We're going to be talking about progress payments, um, you know, things like, when they're done, things like that. Okay. We're going to do a lot more on change orders and time extensions. We're going to be spending most of the day dealing with other issues. You can imagine what those would be. We're purposely not going to talk about them now. And we're going to be then the next day, the last day, we're going to be talking about project closeout and construction completion. Okay. So just something to keep in mind. We're going to be back. But what I want to do, and let's get to the right slide here. And it's about slide sorter here. I got two things. Yeah, no, let's do this. I want to put an acronym in front of you I don't want you to forget about called the Fhne. I don't want anyone ever to get a Fhne. A Fhne stands for Federal Aid Ineligibility Notice. We'll talk a lot more about Fhnes later on, but this is sort of, we don't want to go there. This is, it essentially says, you're not compliant. We've done everything we can. We're not going to pay you. You don't want to get a Fhne. We're going to talk a lot more about acronyms. I apologize, but keep that in mind. But more importantly than anything else, what questions have you started to develop? We have this Q&A panel with a couple of folks from local programs, a lady from the Office of Diversity and Opportunity, and 5 folks representing all kinds of different parts of the Federal Highway Administration Division Office. So we're going to end today, and I'll leave this up for as much time as you want. What questions have you got right now that you'd like to have answered? I'll answer some if I can, but more importantly, what I'm probably going to do is aggregate these together and send them to the folks on the Q&A panel. So hopefully we can answer your questions on that third day. So put in any questions you've got. The only questions I don't like are the ones I don't have. So I'll leave this up. It is now noon. Okay, you can go if you want to go. But if you want to put in a few questions that we can then put into the Q&A panel for the third day, please feel free to do so. With that, it's now noon. Everybody have yourself a safe week. We will see you next Tuesday at 8:30. We'll be talking a lot more about compliance, and we'll go from there. Okay? And so we're going to put in any questions you've got, and I will pull the ones from the Q&A pod as well, and we'll get those questions answered. And what I'll probably do is answer some of them first thing next Tuesday. With that, everybody have yourself a safe day. I'm going to leave this up, and we'll go from there. Only one question. That's pretty good. Are they all going to get lunch? I do have a few in the Q&A pod too, by the way. And those from Federal Highway and NYSDOT who are seeing the questions come through, I'll send them out to everybody, and we'll probably answer a few to start the day next Tuesday, and or leave them for the Q&A panel. some good questions coming in. And again, we'll leave that up. I will leave that up for about 3 or 4 more minutes. But you're welcome to add additional questions, and you can always email them in. Okay, we're going to close that poll down. Those questions will stay. I'll pull them off and then we'll aggregate them. But if you have additional questions, if you've got additional concerns, for those of you still on, please feel free to send them in. If you have any more questions you want to ask, just send them directly to myself at davidorr@cornell.edu or clrp@cornell.edu, or you can go to our website and there's some links there, nysltap.cals.cornell.edu. And with that, we're going to call it a day. And Nick, you can go ahead and shut down the session.